Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. So, welcome to this session that was jointly prepared by the School of Collective Intelligence and Faculty of Medical Sciences. So this session is part of this year's Science Week's theme, which is convergence, and it reflects a very particular moment in science. As you know, for decades, neuroscience and cognitive science have inspired the development of artificial intelligence from early computational model to what we are witnessing today with large language models and very sophisticated deep learning systems. However, today we are witnessing a profound shift. AI is no longer inspired by the brain, it is becoming a tool to understand this brain, and increasingly a force that reshapes how we think, learn, and make decisions. But this two-way relationship raises deep questions, questions that this session is designed to confront directly. How does the brain represent the world, not just store the information, but actively construct meaning from it? And is AI showing us what we need entirely new framework? What about the prediction? How exactly does this machinery work? And can AI finally give us the tools to test it rigorously? Our goal in this morning is to explore this relationship and not only answer this question about relationship between brains and machines, but also ask a broader question. What happens when cognition, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence truly converge? To navigate these questions, we have structured this session around two talks. We'll then have a quick Q&A session, followed by a panel discussion that brings these perspectives together, converging these disciplines, just as this week's theme invites us to do. So let me introduce our first speaker. Our speaker leads the Predictive Brain Lab at the Donders Institute at Radboud University in the Netherlands, one of Europe's foremost centers for cognitive neuroscience. His work asks how the brain uses prior knowledge and internal models to make sense of the world, how artificial neural networks can serve both as computational models of cortical feedback and as precision instruments for probing neural data in vision and language. In his talk, as AI as a window into the predictive brain, he will show us how AI is helping transform a compelling but elusive theory of the brain into precise, empirically grounded science. Please help me welcome Professor Floris de Lange from the Netherlands.
Okay, thanks very much, Manon, for that wonderful introduction. It's really an amazing place. I'm really honored to be here. It's, the amount of energy that you have here is fantastic. And I also really like the topic that you have for this Science Week, the topic of convergence, because I think convergence is I think, incredibly important in science in general, but I think maybe specifically in the field that I am most interested in, I think it's really a field of convergence. So my name is Floris de Lange, and I'm heading the Predictive Brain Lab. And what I want to talk to you about today is some recent results and some recent research from my lab where we are using AI in different ways to try to further our understanding of how the brain implements the mind. Now, to start off, so I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and I think cognitive neuroscience is really a discipline of convergence. So in that sense, I think it's a discipline that lends itself well to the topic of this Science Week. So I think you could say there's two main ingredients to cognitive neuroscience. One is, of course, the brain. We have had neuroscientists studying the structure and the function of the brain for decades. And until, I would say, a couple of decades ago, there were also experimental psychologists, cognitive scientists that were studying cognitive functions, sort of independently from those. Now, what cognitive neuroscience is really the sort of the marriage of those disciplines. So how cognitive functions arise or emerge, if you will, from the interactions between different modules in the brain. And this is also exemplified by this Venn diagram where you can see that cognitive neuroscience sort of borrows constructs and information from many different disciplines. And so on this one, it's so-called computer science. I think AI is really one that is also like more and more influencing this and leading us to kind of revise our hypothesis about both how the mind and the brain works. So yeah, in the lower part here, you see several cognitive functions. The cognitive functions that I will be talking about particularly today, that I'm going to zoom in on, are perception and language. So those are the ones that I will sort of use as illustrations for how AI has kind of transformed our understanding. Now, to get us all on the same page, I think perception or seeing, for example, it's well known that this is not sort of a passive process of registration, but that there is a lot of sort of knowledge that goes into that process. I think one example of this is when you look at all these kind of stimuli. I think many of you will not be able to help seeing faces in the cup of coffee, the dishwasher, etc. Even though obviously this is a bit of a false percept, right? There's not really a face in any of them. I think what this exemplifies is that, that we have a lot of knowledge and beliefs about the world outside us, and we project that knowledge when we are trying to make sense of the input that we are receiving. And that leads us, in this case, to this phenomenon that is called sometimes pareidolia, the phenomenon of seeing patterns in noise, effectively. And another example I've provided you with here. So here, when you look at this blob in isolation, it might be rather difficult to make out what it is. Perhaps it's a person, but it could be anything really. But if I take this blob and sort of put it into two specific spatial contexts, you can see that it obtains a quite distinct meaning depending on where it is. So here we really have the same blob, so over here and over there. The only thing different is that it's a 90-degree rotation and that it's put at a different location. And immediately it becomes a car or a pedestrian, depending on where it is. And I think what this shows us is that perception is not just the analysis of the input, but in this case that the context, the spatial context, provides us with priors or predictions that help us to interpret the element. Now, what is the classic view of how visual perception is implemented in the brain? I think this is kind of like a textbook picture that you would often see. So here we have the brain. So information, of course, enters the brain via the eye, and then via the LGN, that's a structure in the midbrain, in the thalamus, it would go to sort of the first cortical area, V1, that is tuned for simple features like edges and lines. And from there on, it kind of like travels through the brain to like more and more complex processors. And the classical view is that sort of perception emanates at the end of that cascade. So that there's a hierarchical feed-forward process that culminates in perception. And I think AI has actually kind of reinforced that view to some degree even. For example, in the form of convolutional neural networks. So this was one of the sort of big success stories of AI, where CNNs, convolutional neural networks, such as AlexNet and later ones, are indeed quite capable at recognizing categories based on pixels, based on visual input. But if we think back of the example of one slide ago, you could imagine that that a neural network or a brain might actually be quite confused by this input. Because here we have the same input that takes on a different meaning depending on the context in which it's placed. So that, I think, already suggests that this cannot be the full story, that a simple feed-forward analysis from elements to objects is not going to be sufficient to understand how we understand the visual world. Now, the hypothesis that my lab has been looking at for the last decade, I would say, is this idea that the brain is actually a bit like a scientist. It's a hypothesis-generating device. And if we look back at this example of a scene with objects in it, we can see that there are that the world around us is really structured in a hierarchical fashion. So here you would have a scene that is made of objects that are made of smaller objects, and then all the way down to the features. And again, here you can already see that if you would look at these object features in isolation, it will be rather difficult to see what they are. So, so this, for example, in isolation, you would probably have a hard time saying that this is a backlight or that this is a tire. But then within, so here the higher levels really help constrain the interpretation of the lower levels. And this is something that happens not only sort of in our perception, but this is something that happens in the brain the whole time. So as I already showed you on the previous slide, there are these different regions that process different features of the input. But now when we look at how those brain regions actually communicate, we see that there is not only sort of a strong role for feed-forward connections, but that there's an equally strong role for feedback connections in the brain. So the brain is connected bidirectionally and talking to itself sort of like in both directions. Now, ideas, sort of like theoretical ideas around how this kind of bidirectional neural architecture can implement things like visual perception, sometimes go under the name of predictive coding. There's also belief propagation, and sort of again in the AI world, generative adversarial networks will be one example of something that is a little bit akin to this kind of bidirectional exchange. And indeed, when we look at anatomy, we see that the brain is actually mostly talking to itself. So there's like a vast amount of like local connectivity, but also sort of like, visual regions do not just get information from the visual sense, from the eyes, but they get information from pretty much everywhere else in the brain as well. So there's really a lot of crosstalk within the brain that makes this possible. Now, a final empirical observation that is in line with this is that brain regions are actually not so much kind of representing features, but they might to some degree better be described as signaling surprise about those features. Now, what do I mean with that? So I'll give you 3 quick examples. This is an empirical study from the lab of David Schneider, where they looked at the auditory cortex in mice. And these mice were running on a treadmill, and whenever they would move their paw, it would elicit a specific tone. It would elicit a 4 kilohertz tone. Now, after the mice were, got used, were familiarized with that situation, what you find is that whenever the mouse was running and receiving this 4 kilohertz tone, there was hardly any neural activity left. So this is the red traces and then in the middle. So where the mouse is running and then here's this 4 kilohertz tone. So there's hardly any neural activity. While when you're presenting sort of like a surprising tone and a tone that is different from what it is used to when it's running, you will see still like a strong amount of activity. In the language domain, we also noticed for a very long time already that when we present words that are surprising given the context, we get a strong neural activity in the language system. And also reward prediction errors are also something that is kind of like a success story within neuroscience, where in the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, this is a region that was traditionally thought to be sort of like a reward region. So people thought like, okay, whenever something rewarding happens, this area becomes active. But that's actually not the right way of thinking about it. A better way of thinking about it is that this region signals sort of the surprise with respect to a reward. So when there is an unexpected reward, when you would now all of a sudden get a monetary reward, let's say, this region will strongly activate. When you're expecting a reward that you do not get, you'll get a suppression of activity. And when you get a reward that is exactly what you expected, the region will remain silent at baseline activity levels. All right, so now what I want to do during my talk today is walk you through 2 applications of AI that I think are quite interesting today. The first one is going to be looking at AI as a model organism. Another way of thinking about this is to treat AI a little bit like an animal. So just like we would sometimes turn to an animal model to study things like visual perception, we can also turn to sort of like a silico model. And of course, there are some sort of assumptions that need to be made. So it's only as good as the model is. But it also gives you an enormous amount of flexibility to change almost anything. You can change the architecture, you can change the learning rules, you can change the data that the model gets. So it's also, in that sense, a very powerful way of looking at, of treating AI as a model organism. And here the question that I would like to answer is how different types of feedback signals change the neural representations within this model, as well as the behavior that it outputs. So that's what you could call like maybe the more ambitious use of AI, where we really put AIs next to humans and say, let's try to see to which degree the artificial brain, the artificial neural network may have some similarities to the biological neural network. Now, a more modest use, which I think is still extremely interesting, is to use AI as a tool to quantify things in the environment, for example. And in the second part, I will show you a few examples of how we use AI as a tool to quantify predictability in the real world. And this we've done in the realm of both vision and language. And if I get to it, I will give you an example of both. All right, but let's start with AI as a model organism. And here, the example is going to be about visual perception again. Now, we know that human visual perception is incredibly robust. So when I show you this image, you can immediately see it's a car. But also when I show it from a different angle with some noise superimposed, it's still easy to see a car. If I occlude almost all of the image, you can still recognize it. It doesn't matter what type of occlusion. And obviously this doesn't only work for cars, so you can also recognize airplanes. So human perception is what we call extremely robust against noise. Now this is something that in the old days of convolutional neural networks, this was a problem. So convolutional neural networks were sometimes not that robust to different types of noise. But of course, by now these networks are also have become more and more robust. And one of the ways in which you can create a more robust neural network for object recognition is by adding feedback. And the feedback, so this is one example of a study where they did that. So when they compare human performance to sort of like one of the earliest convolutional neural networks, AlexNet, they found that human performance was still better, specifically when there was like a lot of occlusion in the images. But this became sort of the neural network would catch up if they would imbue it with feedback. And the feedback in this case was trained in the same way as the feed-forward weights, simply like to try to recognize the object. So that was the objective. This is another study where they also used the neural network and added feedback, but here they added a very different type of flavor of feedback. And this is what I refer to as predictive feedback. And the goal of predictive feedback is not so much to just try to help categorizing the object, but the goal here is to try to predict neural representations itself. So in this case, feedback from one layer to the layer below would effectively try to predict what that layer below is representing. Now, the question that we had here is like, well, how does feedback help object recognition of this challenging visual input, depending on what type of feedback? And here, again, I think the beauty of an AI model is that we can keep everything completely under control. So we have two networks, we give it exactly the same amount of neurons, the same amount of connections, the same data that we feed it. The only thing we're going to change here is like how we train the feedback in the model. Whether we train the feedback in the, what you could call the vanilla way to just recognize the object, or are we training the feedback weights to try to predict neural activity within the network? So that's the task trained and the predictive feedback. Okay, here are just some more details. I think I'll just skip over them for now. So, but very briefly, we try to sort of approximate the ventral visual stream of the human brain. So it has, or the primate brain, I should say. So it had like 4 cortical regions that were connected feed forward as well as feedback. We also looked at lateral recurrence. And here are just the data. So there were like 100 classes of input. So the networks were trained on all kind of exemplars of men, women, car, phone, etc., like 100 classes. And critically, during or after the networks were trained, we also fed them with images that had increasing degrees of noise to see how robust they were to noise. Now, first, some sort of sanity check results. So, of course, when we look at the feed-forward network, we see that it performs best for clear input. So input that does not have any noise. And so on the x-axis, if you go to the right, we have like we're increasing the amount of noise. And obviously the classification accuracy drops monotonically as you increase the noise. That's not very surprising. Now what happens if we add feedback? So what I show you here on the right is sort of the difference in performance, again as a function of noise, for the different types of feedback and lateral recurrence. And the critical ones to compare here are the task-trained feedback, so that's like the red and also the yellow in some degree, compared with the blue one. And you can see that even though both of them seem to help, they help in different cases. So what you see is that the task-trained feedback really helps improve the accuracy for noise levels that are actually sort of similar to what it was trained on, so for like noise-free images, whereas predictive feedback helps, in a sense, more with noisy images. So if anything, it kind of even decreases accuracy for the noise-free images, but it does help a lot for images that have some noise. So the take-home point here is that predictive feedback seems to improve accuracy for noisy images, whereas the task-trained feedback improves accuracy for stimuli that have sort of similar noise levels as the training images. So we thought that this could imply perhaps that what this predictive feedback is doing is some form of denoising, that it's trying to kind of clean up the neural representation. So to look at that a little bit more directly, what we looked at is like how sort of like similar the neural activity patterns within our neural network were to the neural activity pattern for a clean image. This is what we call sort of like, the activity pattern similarity. And again, for the feed-forward network, you see that it goes down as you increase the noise. So the noisier the image, the less the neural activity pattern looks like the neural activity pattern of a clean image. That makes sense. Now, what happens when we compare sort of this activity pattern similarity, how it changes when you, again, turn on the feedback, so when you add feedback. And here you can clearly see that predictive feedback sort of denoises the images. It kind of makes it more similar to a clean image, whereas for a task-trained feedback, it's exactly the opposite. If anything, you could say that it kind of, it probably doesn't create sort of a noisier representation, but it creates a representation that is more dissimilar than the representation of a clean image. Okay, and the final point here, we looked at this also from the perspective of dimensionality. So a neural activity pattern can be said to have a certain degree of dimensions. So a simple way to look at the dimensionality of an activity pattern is by doing a principal component analysis. So if all the activity or the variability can be captured in a single component, that will be a very low dimensional activity. And if it's very complex, if it has a lot of sort of things that contribute to the activity patterns, then you have a high dimensional neural activity. Now here what we find, again, unsurprisingly, is that if we increase the noise, the representational dimensionality goes up. So it becomes more high dimensional, which makes sense because the noise is independent from the image. So there's like more sources that contribute to the activity patterns. And here again, when we look at the change in dimensionality, we see that predictive feedback reduces this dimensionality. So it creates a more low dimensional neural representation, whereas task-trained feedback does exactly the opposite. It creates a more high-dimensional representation. So the dimensionality reduces by predictive feedback, but increases by task-trained feedback. Okay, so what can we conclude from this kind of like purely sort of machine learning exercise? I would say that it shows that, that feedback is not a unitary phenomenon, but depending on what goal you give the algorithm, when training the feedback weights, it will in both cases improve object recognition, but in distinct ways, in very different ways. And what we find specifically here is that predictive feedback seems to denoise the representations in early layers, and that results in a sort of a robust and lower dimensional representation, whereas task-trained feedback does something quite different. I think what it's probably doing instead is to learn some kind of noise representation and sort of create thereby a higher dimensional representation where both the noise and the input are represented in the network. And now, of course, what is critical and which we still need to do in more detail is to compare this with biology. To see like, okay, well, which of these motifs do we see in neurobiology? And I think there is, at this point, not that much data. So there is one study from Marlene Cohen and John Monsell that looked at dimensionality, or by virtue of looking at the Fano factor, where they show also sort of that feedback can reduce sort of the dimensionality in the case of an attentional manipulation. So I think there is some indirect evidence that seems to favor sort of the predictive feedback in this sense. But I also think that a lot of more work is needed here still. All right, so that concludes sort of my the part on AI as a model organism. So what we did here is really like we just looked only at an artificial neural network and gave it sort of like different types of training, and then try to understand how does that then lead to the neural representations. Now, this is, of course, something that we cannot do in biology, ever. So even not in invasive recordings, not in non-invasive recordings. So I think that's why this is a really interesting way to try to get more understanding about how different loss functions, how different goals of a network can lead to different neural representations. But now let me turn to a very different use of AI, which is using AI sort of more as a tool. And here, let me start again from visual perception. And from the observation that I already shared with you a few slides ago, that when input is predictable, it elicits much less neural activity. And this is one study from the macaque monkey, where they looked at neurons in the inferotemporal cortex. So that's in the sort of like at the apex of the ventral visual stream. It's an area that is very selective for specific object stimuli. So it's the area of the brain with which you can recognize objects, one could say. And what you can see here in this graph is that for the same stimulus, so for the same image B, there's like a massive reduction of activity. So the red and the blue lines are like the amount of firing activity in those neurons. And it's the same input, but you can see that there is much less activity when that input was predicted by the image preceding it, compared to when that image was not predicted by the image preceding it. So that, I think, is already like an important message, that the visual system doesn't just react to stimuli, but it massively is influenced by whether those images are predicted. And similar effects have been found in humans. So here, for example, from our lab, we looked at this through the lens of functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. And there you also see that the entire ventral visual stream really is strongly suppressed for input that is predictable. Now, what David Richter, a grad student in my lab, was curious about is like, well, what is the brain actually surprised by? What is in this prediction error? So very concretely within this kind of context, so when you see an image of a sofa that is predicting this image of a compass, what is it actually surprised by? Is it surprised by by images that are just slightly different? So if you would move the compass to a different location, would that already surprise the brain? Or would it only be surprised if it's like a very different type of image, like an animal instead of a tool? And our initial hypothesis was that it might really depend on which region in the brain you're looking at. That if you are a simple visual cortical neuron, that then you're going to be surprised if there is a violation with respect to the feature that you are encoding, the simple features. But we had an alternative hypothesis, and this turns out to be the correct hypothesis, which is that surprise is something that really only arises at sort of the top of the cortical hierarchy and is propagated down from there. So in that sense, surprises that would be sort of like encoded by those kind of like very abstract, high-level visual regions would be the sort of surprises that strongly drive the brain. Now, how do we go about this? So in order to kind of make some progress on this question, we provided or we presented participants with a variety of different stimuli. And again, we can make use of AI now to sort of like quantify these stimuli along different dimensions. So here I'm showing you another convolutional neural network, which is effectively just a neural network that takes input and has a series of cascading processes. And then at the very end of the network, it will tell you what the input is, whether it's a guitar or a person, etc. Now, and when we inspect sort of the neural activity patterns of a network like AlexNet, we can see that at sort of lower levels, so for example, the second layer of AlexNet, things that have similar low-level properties will elicit similar neural activity patterns. Whereas things that have different low-level properties, for example, if we compare a stimulus that has like a lot of orientations to the left with another stimulus that have a lot of orientations to the right, those stimuli will elicit very different activity patterns in the low levels of this network. So what you're seeing here is a matrix. It's so-called like a representational similarity matrix. And it tells you sort of like how different are the different stimuli. And what you can appreciate potentially is that the representational dissimilarity matrix is very different when you look at low levels compared to when you look at high levels. So for high levels, guitars are all like guitars, and it doesn't matter what the orientation of the location of the guitar is. Whereas a guitar and a person would be a very different concept, and therefore also elicit a very different activity pattern. So I think this is a neat way to try to quantify stimuli at different levels of complexity, at the different levels of representational complexity. And indeed, when we look at the activity patterns in the brain, so that's what I'm showing you here on the bottom, you can see that in the back of the brain, sort of like really at the occipital pole, where the early cortical regions are, the early visual cortex, there you can see that the activity patterns have a similarity structure that is very much similar to this kind of low levels similarity structure of AlexNet. So that's what I mean with the cold colors, like the bluish colors. Whereas if you move more and more anteriorly and more medially, you can see that now the representational structure in the brain is more similar to a high level of AlexNet, so to like to the more categorical level. All right, but now the question was, of course, like, what is the brain surprised by? So let's look at the surprise representations. And what we did here is like that for every stimulus where there was a violation, so people expected a specific object, we then quantified sort of how surprising or how different is that stimulus that people are seeing compared to what they were expecting along those kind of different axes. So ranging from low level to high level complexity. So, so for every expected image, we would have like a whole series of unexpected images that had a different distance to the expected images, either in in a low-level similarity space or in a high-level similarity space. And that allowed us to answer this question. Now, what is the answer? The answer is that the entire brain, so from the very first cortical area, V1, all the way to the very last visual cortical area, is showing a monotonic increase in activity as a function of high-level surprise. So that is effectively if you're expecting a guitar and you get something that is very different in terms of like high-level properties. And here you see another depiction of this. So low-level surprise was not relevant in any part of the brain. So it's very much in line with this second hypothesis, that surprise is calculated at the top and then propagated down. And in a follow-up study, we also looked at it, or David Richter also looked at this with EEG, and there he also finds that sort of the time course of this high-level surprise. So you can see that the surprise signal is something that is visible about 200 milliseconds after the stimulus is shown. So that's when you get an increase in neural activity that is following sort of the distance in this high-level space. Okay, so that's all I had on visual perception. And sort of for my last part, I'm going to move to language. So what does the brain predict when we listen to a story? So effectively what we are doing now. And here, I think it's, again, quite clear that the brain can respond very vigorously to surprising linguistic input. So there is this hallmark papers by Marta Kutas, for example, from the 80s, that when we present people with a sentence like the milk was too cold to cry, then there's like a strong response in the brain. And if it's the milk was too cold to eat, it's still somewhat of a strong response, but less so. And obviously for drink, you get the lowest response. So there's kind of like this dose-response relationship between how strange the word is given the preceding context and how much the language brain is activated. But you might say that, well, this is a very sort of prediction encouraging setting. So where we have these sentences that end also with a very strange word. So what we wanted to know is like, well, does this happen actually in the real world? So does the brain also predict upcoming language in more naturalistic settings? The approach that we took for this is we had people, or we downloaded data where people were listening to an audiobook of The Old Man and the Sea. So this is a data set that we could obtain from another site, from Trinity College Dublin. And there was also a source level MEG data set. So MEG is another way of like looking at neural activity non-invasively in humans that were listening to a different audiobook, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Now the critical trick that we applied here is like, well, of course we had this audio input that, that generated activity in the brain. But we then also fed every word of the audiobook to an artificial neural network, in this case, GPT-2XL. So for current day purposes of like using language models, this is really like a baby model. This is really not a very impressive model indeed. But for the purposes of comparability with humans, it's actually quite a useful model. And it's and later models, even though they're more potent, they actually show less convergence with respect to sort of human behavior. But the critical point here is that these networks can calculate, by virtue of like making predictions about every word given the preceding context, they can calculate how surprising every lexical item is in this audiobook. Okay, so just to make that, to illustrate it visually, so let's imagine this context. It made the boy sad too. Then you can see that there's kind of like a whole distribution of lexical predictions where think is the most probable next word, but it could also be see, no, hear, etc. And lexical surprise can then be quantified by information theoretic, in an information theoretic way by simply taking the minus log probability of the word given the context. Now, what we found in both EEG and MEG was that this probabilistic prediction model strongly outperformed baseline models in its ability to predict neural activity. So what we're looking at here is like prediction performance. How well is this model able to predict neural activity? And when we look at like when and where does this model then indeed predict brain activity, we see something quite sort of classical, where around sort of like 400 milliseconds after a word is uttered, there's a strong increase in activity as a function of sort of the lexical surprise of that word. And when you look at the neuroanatomy of this effect, you see that it's mostly sort of engaging the left lateralized posterior part of the language network. Now, the final thing I'll show you is that we can do something a little bit more interesting than just look at predictability in language. We can also try to actually analyze these predictions. So I showed you this already, that we can derive sort of the lexical prediction distribution from GPT. But you can do something a little bit more interesting, which is analyze that prediction distribution, for example, in terms of its syntax. So one thing you can see is that here all the candidate words that have some probability mass are verbs. So if you sort of like retranslate the lexical prediction in terms of a syntactic prediction, you could say that it's extremely likely in this particular case that the next word is going to be a verb. You can do something similar for semantics. So you can see like what is the semantic what is the semantic vector on average of all these kind of probable next words that could occur. So, and then you can compare this kind of semantic prediction, sort of using a word-to-vec or a glove embedding, to the actual word and calculate surprisal, but now in a semantic domain. And finally, you could simply do a pronunciation lookup for each of these words and create a phonemic prediction based on that. Now, this is the last empirical slide. So what we found was that basically all of these forms of surprisal mattered for the brain. So the brain doesn't simply predict lexical inputs. It's not just predicting the next lexical item, the next word, But it's making predictions about syntax, it's making predictions about semantics, and it's making predictions about the phonology, the phonemic representations at slightly different points in time and in slightly different parts of the brain. But here you can really see that all of these different types of predictions are concurrently operational within the human brain. All right, let me summarize. So in my first part, I showed you that predictive feedback improves categorization, in this case visual categorization, in an artificial neural network by denoising the early representations. So by creating cleaner representations within the brain. Then, sort of like switching from AI as a model to AI as a tool, I showed you that the brain is making a rather particular type of predictions within the visual system, namely sort of predictions about, that live sort of at a high level of abstraction, and that prediction errors at that level of abstraction are then broadcast throughout the visual system. And finally, I showed you that the brain seems to spontaneously predict language, and it doesn't do so at like only the semantic level, for example, but it seems to do so at like at different levels of abstraction while it's listening to an audiobook. And I think that the final point that I'll make, which is of a more general point, is I think that AI in all of these cases has really helped us to understand the human mind and brain, both as a model and a tool. So I think it's an incredibly powerful new tool that we have that can help us kind of like better understand ourselves. With that, I'll close. These are the people that presented, or whose work I presented today. So a lot of credits goes out to them. And I thank you for your attention.
Please help me thank Professor Flores for his talk again, and thank you for having this special thing. So Professor De Lange has taken us from broad theoretical intuition to empirical precision, showing how AI, both as a model, as a tool, I will quote this final line that you presented, has helping us map the brain's predictive architecture and understand the mind and the brain. But beneath this question, it lies a foundational concept shared by both neuroscience and AI, which is representation. So this concept will be explained by my colleague, Professor Karim Fifel, from the Faculty of Medical Sciences. His work spans, okay, thank you, let me introduce, okay, thank you. So the Professor Karim work spans neuroscience and cognitive science with a particular interest in the theoretical foundation of brain research. And today, he will invite us to step back and examine a concept so central to cognitive science that we rarely stop to question it. What does it actually mean for the brain to represent something? And is AI now prompting us to rethink the answer from the ground up? In his talk, The Concept of Representation in Neuroscience and AI, he will challenge us to rethink how the brain encodes and transforms information and what role AI plays in paradigm shifts already underway. Please help me welcome Professor Karim Fifel from Faculty of Medical Sciences. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Manal, for the presentation. Thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to present this morning, the talk about representation. So to start up, I have to confess, actually, that when I was asked to do this, I really hesitated a little bit. And I hesitated for two reasons. The first one, I already expressed to Manal that I'm not really an AI person. Actually, I'm learning AI from my students, to be honest. So I'm not an AI person. So I'm really a neuroscientist. That's my background. The second reason is mainly you, the audience. So when I thought about the audience, I thought about students, I thought about colleagues, and then I was thinking about also philosophers. So we have philosophers among us. So the idea is how can I actually make justice to this diverse audience while talking about neural representation? So throughout my presentation, so I will deal with this concept, keeping in mind that I'm talking to such a diverse audience. So I will try to do justice to all of you. All right. So representation. So what this is all about? Yeah, as if those two reasons are not enough. So when I was actually preparing my talk, so I found this paper. And this paper claims that actually AI can do actually with us researchers. I'm a researcher. So this paper actually in Nature was published claiming that an AI model can actually make the whole process of publishing reliable scientific results, from drawing hypotheses, reliable hypotheses from my background, until really publication, until really peer reviewing. So this is just published 2-3 days ago. So this is really serious. So AI is threatening our identity as a researcher. So then I said, okay, this is really serious. So how can I deal with this AI? So let's deal with this AI also as someone that is threatening really our identity as a researcher. Really, it's kind of a child that you actually teach something and then in the end claims that it can take over actually what you are doing. This is how it actually reminds me of this AI and research in general. So what is a neural representation? So we all know, so the brain, so if I get out from here, I'm still, okay. So the brain actually represents information through our 5 senses, okay? So basically, it collects a lot of information, and through this information, they are encoded in the brain, and then after the encoding and processing of this information, we have a plethora of behavior that characterizes us as a humans first, and then also as communicating subjects. So it makes us actually philosophers. So I think, therefore I am. So that's basically what Descartes is saying. So thinking itself is really a representation. So, the concept really touches on the identity of us as humans. So it has a huge impact on our jurisprudence because, just to tell you, so some of the fMRIs have been already represented and have been introduced in the court in order to actually argue for or against some people in the court. So the notion how we actually look at fMRI, how we interpret fMRI data has a tremendous implication on our jurisprudence and our law. It has also, of course, I'm from FMS, Faculty of Medical Science. It has also huge implications in the clinic. So in terms of robotics, in terms of brain-machine interfaces, so those has already revisionalized the way we actually do medicine, we treat disorders. So I will be touching this actually during my talk. So the brain-machine interfaces, they really rely on the concept of representation. So what is really the signals that are computed in the brain, how they are interpreted in order to come up with a reliable outcome that is actually medically reliable for our patients. And also it makes us also, it impacts also even our society in general, all right? So if we have access to your representation, that can really shape our society in general, the way we want our society to be organized. So this is really serious stuff. So I will be talking about the representation, so how and mainly how artificial intelligence can help us actually decorticate this notion of representations and whether it is even possible to do so. I will be actually adopting a little bit the critical stance than you, Floris, during the presentation, okay? So in order to get access to this representation, basically the brain is an organ that actually interprets or gets information and transforms them into electrical signals. So we have to use basically signals that are representing this representation, okay? So in neuroscience in general, what we do, we basically try to catch the electrical activity of the brain. Those are the methods. So Floris has already mentioned fMRI. So we also use EEG. He also mentioned EEG. We can also use even high resolution single unit recording activity from the brain. And then we try to guess what really the brain is doing. So in a nutshell, my talk is really trying to answer those two fundamental questions. Is it possible for us as a cognitive neuroscientist and neuroscientists to crack this neural code? Okay, so to know a little bit more about this representation. And if so, how artificial intelligence can help, and if it can help, in what way it can help. All right, a little bit of history. So, of course, I can go back to history to phrenology, but just for the sake of the presentation, so I will mention those two great physiologists and actually neurosurgeons. So the first one, I'm sure the audience know a little about this, Charles Sherrington. So he's a physiologist, has a tremendous impact on the way we actually understand reflexes, so in medicine basically. And he went on to get a Nobel Prize. And then the other one is a Canadian neurosurgeon, so well-known Canadian neurosurgeon who worked on epileptic patients. And he was the first one to actually make the first cartography of the brain. Because actually in epileptic patients, you would like to take out the epileptic center. So before you do that, you have to make sure that you are not cutting the other things that are not from the brain, to cutting parts of the brain that are not pathological. So in order to do that, he used to basically imply electrical signals on the brain and then see the correspondence in terms of phenomenology. But what is really interesting, actually, in the history of those two scientists is that in the very beginning, I mean, their work that I just mentioned now was really kind of an early work that they did. But then towards the end of their life, and basically on their very rich, actually, scientific endeavors, so they actually come up with the conclusions that the mind is a mysterious mind. And they really are adopting kind of dualistic approach into how the brain actually works. Okay, and this is illustrated by the two last books that they published just before they died. In a way, my talk also tries to understand why this conversion. So what really makes those philosophers, those scientists converge to actually believing that the brain is so mysterious? Okay, I will give you the answer right away. So the answer right away for these early neurophysiologists is that the brain is mainly composed of associative cortical areas. So when we talk about the brain, so what is actually shown in red there, it's the motor area. It's the precentral motor area of the brain, which is responsible for the last signal that leads to the movement, for example, if you want to move, okay? And then what is actually shown in area number 44, so that's basically the language area. This is the Broca area that is responsible for the articulation of our language, okay? So the idea I want to say here is that basically, these scientists actually, when they were actually mapping the brain, they noticed that most of the brain does not correspond in a one-to-one relationship with actually outputs, with the behavior. And those basically are mainly the associative cortical areas that are responsible for the cognitive abilities that the brains are actually doing. So the question now is, for me, the question is that probably artificial intelligence is at the same crossroad as was these neurophysiologists when they actually looked at the brain this way. What I want to say is that it's probably that artificial intelligence can help actually decorticate the neural code simply because the nature of the inputs that are actually dealing with is kind of primary inputs. So it's the information that are coming from the primary cortical areas and sensory areas that are more readily actually possible to be decorticated, and the more you go to associative cortical areas, probably artificial intelligence will have some limitation. So that's basically my connotation. Okay, so in order to do that, so let's now get into a little bit of philosophy. So is it possible to crack the neural code? Okay, as a neuroscientist, as a cognitive neuroscientist, so I am working with the assumption that that's possible. But philosophers are hard to convince. This is one of them, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Ludwig Wittgenstein, basically, he does not believe in this. He believes that it is really impossible to draw any information from the brain that is of help. And this is his quotation that I want just to tell you. So, oh, sorry. So he basically says that no supposition seems to me more natural than there is no process in the brain correlated with associating or with thinking, so that it would be impossible to read off thoughts processes from brain processes, okay? And then he went on to say, why should this order not proceed, so to speak, out of chaos? It's a little bit of philosophy. To decorticate this, so he developed his theory of picture theory. So what he says basically is that the reality we have access to, it's just a picture. So we don't know the internal workings actually of the system. This is in reality in general. This is mainly for language. He was talking in the context of language, but the same thing is valid for the brain. When we have a picture of the brain working, it's a picture. So it's not the inner working of the brain. So this is my stance also in relation to how AI can actually contribute to decorticate the concept of neural context, of the neural representation. The reason for Wittgenstein to say such a bold actually statement, it's simply he says that the reality, it's not what we see in the lab. The reality is so diverse. We have so lot of parameters that are simply impossible to control. So, and those parameters, they are really absorbed into the brain, and how are we to really draw any reliable conclusions from such chaotic actually depiction of the reality? Okay. So an example. So as scientists, so in order to deal with Wittgenstein, or to deal with this notion of the impossibility to actually represent reality, so I would just want to use this example of when we boil water. When we boil water, so the heat, when we increase the temperature, basically we start to see the bubbles coming up from water. So that's the first thing we do, that out of observation. We can use correlation basically in order to draw some meanings of the data. That's what we do as neuroscientists as well. We get data, we actually correlate that with outcomes. And then from correlation, we try to manipulate the parameters. That's basically causation. And then by manipulating those parameters, we try to draw actually some laws that will help us decorticate the neural representation. But if I tell you why actually water boils at 100 degrees, you can tell me because basically with the pressure, atmospheric pressure and all that stuff, you can tell me all the laws. But then if I can actually, I'm boiling water because I'm preparing tea. Okay, hence the third aspect of representation, which is teleology. The aboutness of our experiences, the aboutness of our thoughts. Okay, those things I believe are the most challenging. If artificial intelligence wants to replace researchers, it has to deal with this concept as well. And that's probably what I believe. It's a little bit difficult, although I'm not really skeptical. So I am really leaving the door open for AI to challenge us all. But I still believe this is really challenging to do. And by the way, this is also recently actually well articulated in this paper. So there's a neuroscientist, a cognitive neuroscientist, that are talking exactly about those three aspects of causation, representation. Sorry. All right. So let's dive in. In order to actually illustrate this, another example, I gave you the example of boiling water. Another example is why I'm presenting actually this talk. Okay, why I'm presenting this talk. So I'm presenting this. I can come up with a lot of reasons. Okay, I'm presenting this talk because I like what I'm doing. I presented this talk because we are students. We are recruiting students. So I want to give them background to my work so that they can come and work with us. I'm presenting this because they are looking for promotion. All sorts of things. So I can really come up with a lot of fictive actually scenarios. The question is it really possible for actually even neuroscience, cognitive neuroscientists, to actually to capture the real reason behind a set of behavior that we see in the environment? Okay, and this is basically what I draw. I'm using actually Daniel Dennett to just illustrate. He's also kind of skeptical. So he says that in an intelligent system, when it tries to explain intentions, when it tries to explain actually representation in the brain or in an artificial intelligence system or in a computer, we always actually borrow what we try to explain. That's what he calls the loans of intelligence. Otherwise, if I want to make it much more clear, you have no chance to know the reason why I am boiling water if you don't ask me that. That's the point. And the challenge of artificial intelligence, is it possible from the neural activity that we are getting just to answer you without asking me? Okay, that's basically in a very simplistic way. Okay, I'm going to use 3 examples in order to answer these questions. Number 1, language. Okay. Number 2, I'm going to talk about memory, and number 3, my actual expertise, my field of expertise, which is sleep and health. Okay. So the first one, language. Why am I using language? Because I will come to this, but before this, so why I'm using language? So language, in the end, the cognitive scientists that are actually believing that we can actually have a reliable representation, reliable decoding of the brain representation. They say basically whatever you try to explain. If I ask you, if you have an idea, if you have, for example, an idea that is so transcendental that is difficult to explain. So in the end, what you have as a tool to explain that idea, it's language. So the idea is that whatever I can actually interrogate with you, I can interview with you, and then I will be able to, in the end, to really reach the goal of the intention that you have behind your behavior. Okay. Otherwise, again, if I want to just make this even clear, the idea is it possible to actually know exactly which representation is the one that will be exteriorized among the possible ones that are actuated in the brain? Okay, And in order to answer this question, so I'm using the BMI, so brain-machine interfaces. So I'm saying that the answering this philosophical question, it's exactly the same as the one when we try to answer a clinical case situation. Brain-machine interfaces, so for those who don't know, so brain-machine, so basically you have actually a device that will collect data while a person is doing something. And the idea is that these data, they are processed, and then you feed that to actually models, artificial intelligence models, that will actually then come up with the language communication. So these brain-machine interfaces, they have been applied to several applications. Among them, for example, patients that have problems with language. Okay, some patients, they can actually, for example, they have ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and these might affect, for example, the muscles of the larynx. So in this case, they have trouble actually just communicating. But they still have the possibility, of course, of thinking and all that stuff. So the idea is it possible to capture that activity and then decode that activity and converse and help them just communicate? So why I'm saying this actually is the same problem, is the same philosophical problem, because a recent paper in Cell, they asked this question. So when we are talking, what I am saying, it's not all what I have in mind. I can have something going in my mind which I don't want to say. For these patients, this is a little bit challenging. Imagine I'm actually recording the activity in the brain area that is actually responsible for language, and then what I'm going to read, I'm going to read a lot of options. So which one exactly is the one that this patient wants to articulate? Okay, this is basically the difference between attempted speech and inner speech. I have inner speech. I don't want you to hear what I want to say. But I just want you to hear what I want to articulate. Okay, this is really challenging. It's like I have multiple options. Which one is the one that should be actualized? This paper actually just came about. It's really a landmark paper that claims that it is possible. Okay, what they did. Okay, I already explained the concept of the brain machine. So they actually exposed these subjects to different objects, different words, and then they asked them either to articulate the words or just to think about the words without articulate the words. Okay, and then they record activity, neural activity. Unfortunately, I cannot actually point here, but they can record neural activity in different brain areas that are processing language. Okay, and the idea is from this chaotic representation of the language on the different words, how can you really extract the ones that represent the language that this subject is trying to tell us, okay? And that's basically what they did. So the accuracy, let's go to the accuracy directly. Just to answer the question, they really managed to figure out which ones are attempted vocal speech and which ones are inner speech. And with this, apparently they could do that. So it's really possible to really figure out which representation represents the attempted speech, which one is representing the inner speech. And this is how they did it, actually. They have neural activity. You feed that to what I don't know what it is, so RNN, so I don't know what that is. And then from there, you draw probabilities about phonemic structure. And then from there, you give it again to another black box that they don't know what it is, language model. And from those language model, you have speech. Then you have communication. All right. So imagine a patient, actually, with whom we actually implanted this, says a word like this. I'm going to the bank. And then you wait for 1 hour, 2 hours, they are not back. Where are you going to look for them? I can look for them in the bank. Or if I'm living in just close by to a river, I have to look somewhere else. All right? So that's basically the whole idea between syntax and semantic. Okay? So is it possible for AI to also pinpoint this? Because this is what we want, right? Again, I just picked up this yesterday. Trump, the nation builder. Okay? So depending on who says this, it's completely different meaning. A MAGA person says this, or a Chinese, it's completely different thing. All right, think about it. Another example that I will not actually talk about, it's Tim Hunt, a Nobel laureate. So in 2015, so we had a very bad experience, and it happened to be 2 weeks after we met him. So I was in the Netherlands, we met him, we talked, we did the presentation, and then 2 weeks I heard about a very bad scenario that happened to him. And the reason why it happened to him, it's basically because of these words that he actually said in a conference in Japan. This is what he said: "Let me tell you about my trouble with girls. 3 things happen when they are in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry." Believe me, I will not talk about this, but go and Google it and see. A nightmare. Nightmare happened to this guy because of this. Okay? And all of this has to do with semantic syntax, intention, and all that stuff. All right. Okay, yeah, before I go there, let me tell you, how does artificial intelligence do in terms of really decorticating language? Is it possible for artificial to do such thing? I'm telling you, it's not possible. Just trust me. But I will even tell you, I will try to convince you by actually just illustrating by a much more simpler example, which is basically this paper, the landmark paper, that actually showed that when these large models are actually trained to just differentiate between facts and beliefs, they do fail. Okay? And what they did, so it's a really very big study, and this is what they used. So they have a huge data set from different domains, from mathematics, economics, history, and they have true statements and false statements. They feed these to these models, and they try to see if the model can distinguish between facts and beliefs. Okay? And just, I was surprised also that in the philosophy examples, they used Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein wrote drafts in the Tractatus Logica Philosophica in a prison of war camps during World War I, which is true, but then they changed a little bit that sentence. Okay, just to tell you, so these models, they are still not yet even able to differentiate between facts and beliefs, let alone the idea of content that I talked about. Okay. I'm done with language example. Let's go to example number 2, which is memory. So memory, this is one of the examples that is actually really advanced as a successful example of computational neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, because we really understand a lot about memory. We really understand that the neural code of memory is really well understood. So this is an example of a rat that goes through a track, okay? And then it goes from one area to another area, and then you put an electrode in the hippocampus of these rats, and then you record neural activity of what we call place cells. Place cells, basically, it's types of neurons that gets activated when you are in a coordinate, X, Y, Z coordinate. You change the coordinates, other types of cells are activated. That's what you see basically in those pictures there, in the colors there. A rat will move through the tract, and then depending on the position, you have certain types of neurons that gets activated specifically when that animal is in that zone. Okay, we call them place cells. And then if you record multiple cells, you can know actually the cells that encode the whole trajectory. Okay? And then the idea is it possible, from recording from these neurons, is it possible basically to know the position of the animals or the subjects in a 3D space? Just imagine you don't know the position of the subjects, you just have access to these neural activity data. Is it possible to do that? The answer is yes. So this is an example of study that just took the neural activity data and tried to predict the position of the animals in space. And recently it has been done also in humans with virtual reality. So this is a paper that we discussed recently actually, in which subjects, they basically dive into virtual reality, and then you try to correlate the brain activity with the position in that virtual reality. And it seems that it is possible within theta rhythms, it's possible depending on the phase of the theta cycle to know where the subjects are in the 3D virtual game. Okay. Those are just accuracies. I'm not going to talk that much about them. So it's the idea here, we have the accuracy up to 14 centimeters. The accuracy of the models. They can really predict the real position of the subjects within the variability of 14 centimeters. Okay, so that's if you do it in 1D. If you do it in 2D, so the distance gets a little bit, the error gets a little bit high. No, if you do it in 1D, the errors are higher than in 2D dimensions. Basically, the idea, the more dimensions you add, the accuracy gets up. That's basically the idea. The more data you have, the more data you feed to these models, the more the accuracy of the model gets actually better. I will skip this one. This is how it is done. But still, okay, this is an example I said that is really well understood. But still, when we actually encode location or position, we don't only encode the Euclidean position of the subject. We also encode our experience within the subject, within that space. Sorry, within that space. So this is well known also in this field. So the neural code of memory is tuned or fine-tuned depending on your experience in that position. It's not only the position, it's what you experience in that position. This is just an example in which if I am targeting an area, the way the code will be actually read from the brain is completely different. The way the brain will encode that position will be different than if I'm just moving without thinking about the position itself. Okay, the idea of intention and goal orientation also affects how the brain encodes the navigation system, okay? GPS system. So basically what I'm saying that the encoding of the brain, of memory in the brain is not only a GPS issue, it's a psychological issue in which a lot of parameters, they interfere or they modulate how that code is read from the brain. So in order for you to reliably encode the position of the subject within a 3D space, you don't only have to know the positions X, Y, Z, you also have to know why is the subject in that location. Okay, go and ask AI to tell you what is the purpose of me being here or somewhere else. All right. So anyway, so this is again example number 2 in which, yes, artificial intelligence can help us really know a lot about the phenomenon, but to what extent when we are talking about content, can artificial intelligence help? That's a little bit still critical. Yeah, by the way, I have a student that is touching a little bit on this topic, Idris. Third example, last example, sleep health. Okay, sleep health. So how much of sleep do you need to perform well during your day? Okay, so this is the question we're trying to answer. So some people, they can sleep well with 6 hours of sleep. Some people, they need 8 hours. Some people, they need 10 hours. And without even talking about pathology also, there's a huge variability. So how much sleep do you actually need? A classical model that tries to formalize this was developed by Borbeli, in which basically they said that there are 2 systems that really control about the quality and quantity of sleep, the homeostatic process and the circadian process. What this really means, the homeostatic process basically means the duration. For how long have you been awake? And depending on the duration, the intensity and quality of your sleep will actually be different. The more you stay awake, the more deep your sleep will be. Okay, that's basically the homeostatic pressure. And then you have the circadian pressure, the circadian process, which basically tells you the timing of sleep. We sleep during certain times of the day. All right, so the combination of those 2 models is what we call the 2-process model of sleep regulation. It has been really successful in predicting a lot of normal variations in sleep and also a lot of pathological sleep. But again, this model is a little bit, we started to discover that this model has a lot of limitations because it does not really reflect the reality. And what kind of reality does not reflect? It's exactly the reality that refers to basically what we are as humans. For example, here, a paper just published as well, that shows that actually the healthy sleep duration is modulated by the culture. Okay, so Japanese person can sleep 6 hours and do well. Okay, but then other countries, they really need to go up to 8 hours. So you can see the variability is within 2 hours. So culture can actually impact also the quality, what we call healthy sleep. Another example that illustrates actually this notion of the content of the experience and how that the content of the experience during wakefulness impacts sleep. This is a study that was done in flies. So basically you have flies, they do have 2 peaks of sleep during the day that you can see here. Okay, they have a bimodal sleep pattern. Okay, this is the amount of sleep. So those 2 groups, basically they were exposed to 2 experiences. So you have, those are male flies. They were exposed either to males or females, okay? So, and you see, this is during the day of the exposure. So in gray, that's basically the baseline, okay? And then in blue, those are the animals that were exposed to males. They were mainly fighting, okay? So just fighting. And then the females, I don't have to tell you what they were here doing. So you see the amount of sleep that they had, basically 0, okay? And then what happens afterwards? What happens afterwards is that you would expect these animals, these flies, they were actually completely sleep deprived during the entire 24 hours. Yet, in terms of the amount of sleep that they had afterwards, it's less than the one that were actually stressed. All right. So it's not about how much you stayed awake that will actually condition the quality of your sleep, but it's the experience you had during your wakefulness that will condition the quality of your sleep. Okay. So this is basically the main idea that I am actually tackling in my group. Other examples here: a lot of birds or a lot of animals when they migrate. So they are really undergoing a long duration of sleeplessness, so the complete short duration of sleep, yet they can do very well without really having a lot of negative consequences that are usually associated with sleep deprivation. So the question is, how can we explain this? So this is basically what I am working on, the role of motivation in the modulation of sleep, okay? And basically what we found is that depending on the experience and also the engagement that you have towards your experience, that can impact the quality of sleep that we have afterwards. Okay, so this is really the main conclusion of the paper. Now, is it possible for us to know from brain activity, just to link it with neurorepresentation, is it possible for us to know exactly how does motivation affect sleep? That's what we've been doing, and what we found basically is that depending on your experience, so the EEG signals, the quality of the EEG signals is qualitatively different between the experiences. When animals were exposed to pleasurable experience, the EEG was actually characterized by signal signatures that at the theta level that is different from the animals that were actually exposed to negative experiences. Okay, and from there we can actually reliably predict how does motivation, how is your engagement during the day impact your quality of sleep. All right. So this is basically at the core of what we are trying to do at FMS here. So just to tell you actually the whole picture in terms of sleep health, so the idea of sleep, so the quality of sleep, quantity of sleep, it's not only affected by the duration of your previous wakefulness, but it is affected by a lot of factors, including beliefs and behaviors during your wake experiences, okay? All right, the team that is actually working on this, so those are my students. So, and in relation to this, I would like to thank Rashid. So this is our dean. So for his full support, because we're trying to really develop actually kind of an integrative unit that looks at sleep as a transversal discipline that can affect a lot of disciplines in medicine. All right, I still have 2 or 3 slides in which I will tell you the reason why I believe that artificial intelligence is still limited. Okay. And the reason why artificial intelligence is still limited in terms of reliably tell us about the neurorepresentation of the brain, it's actually the fact that the brain, if I ask you, what if there's no code? What if the code is so variable, or the brain can encode different experiences with the same codes at the same time, or the opposite, or vice versa? That's basically what I think is the issue, and it is well illustrated by this paper by Michel Anderson, in which he talks about this as one of the fundamental organizational principles of the brain. And to illustrate this, theta, I mentioned theta, okay? I mentioned theta activity from the EEG as a reliable marker of motivation, which we found directly can actually help us predict the quality of sleep. So the issue with theta is that historically has been linked with a lot of stuff. It has been linked with motivation, it has been linked with orientation, it has been linked with movement, it has been linked with, and this is just a figure that I draw from Bujaki lab, in which he, throughout the years, so what are the concepts that were linked with what we think is the neural code of motivation or whatever. Okay, so that's really the difficult question that I am tackling. I'm trying to really deal with in terms of how can we use neural activity to reliably talk about neurorepresentation. And then the example I just also found this 2 days ago, just to link it with the talk of Floris. So Floris, he really mentioned actually that in the inferior temporal cortex, that's basically where the images are decorticated. So there's a question that is really that is really creating a kind of a debate in the field is the inferior temporal cortex encoding abstract information, general object information, or specific features that are linked with images. So, and this paper really was a landmark because it solves this actually debate by showing that actually the inferior temporal cortex encodes both of them. It has a specialized coding mechanisms for specific features of the face, but at the same time, it encodes about the general concept of a face. And it seems that it's a kind of a switch that happens within less than 20 milliseconds that actually can tell you whether it is general encoding or specific encoding. All right. So yeah, I believe that this also illustrates, and it has been also done using artificial intelligence, and yeah, basically it really points to the real issue that I have with the artificial intelligence and its ability to help us in this direction. So okay, that's why I come back to the two scientists that I started with. So as you said, maybe you got it now. So it's the same issue. So I believe that artificial intelligence, or even our ability as cognitive neuroscientists to actually talk about cognitive neuroscience, to talk about neurorepresentation, is limited by the fact that the brain is a representational system that can actually represent multiple things, including fictive things, at the same time, while sending the same signals. And this is more true if you go higher in the hierarchy. And the talk of Flores illustrates also some of this actually. The prediction of the brain, as you said, is more actually computed in the higher cortical areas to extract those features than in the lower cortical areas. So I believe it's the same issue that is actually facing artificial intelligence. So, conclusion again to my beloved Wittgenstein: whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Okay. So what's the end point for Wittgenstein? Basically, it's action. Okay, he was invited by Vienna Circle at once, and because he is the founder of the Vienna Circle, and then they invited him because they thought he will actually say a lot of stuff, and then he turned back, and then start citing poetry and all that stuff. It's really fascinating. So for him, it's really action that ends. And this is a prophetic saying in Arabic: "Al-imanu ma waqara fil qalb wa saddaqahu al-amal." Okay, this is the same concept basically, which I can translate basically by this paper that shows indeed that the neural representation of the brain is shaped by our actions. And that's my last message. I don't know if Fouad Al-Aroui is with us, because they had a gift for him, but he's not here. But before that, so the conclusion for students and for us as well, we have to be very careful about artificial intelligence. So those are two recent examples. The AI paradox, what can artificial intelligence do? So I think it can do a lot of harm, because if we don't know really what artificials can do, the limitation of the artificial intelligence, it can really do a lot of stuff. An example here, yeah, I don't have to read it, but the idea is basically that this whole hype about artificial intelligence can be used by some people that have other means in terms of, for example, commercial interest and something, in order to promote their own self-interest, and in contrast to what really artificial intelligence can do. So that's it. That was the gift that I had for Al-Aroui, but he's not here, so he will see it later, I think. Thank you so much for your talk, and then, yeah. Just after? Yeah. All right. Okay. All right. All right. Yeah.
Thank you. Please help me thank Professor Karim Fifel for this interesting talk. Thank you so much. I really learned a lot, because usually as a computer scientist, I always think that is, okay, I'll be using models, I'll be creating models, but understanding this bridge between the brain and AI in general, how both of them can shape each other, which is very fascinating. So thank you, and I'm sure we'll have more to discuss about this. We'll move directly to the panel discussion, and we'll have an interactive session with our panelists and the audience, where we can ask each other questions. So let me first thank again Professor Karim, and then we'll invite again Professor Flores de Longe to come join us. We'll have also Professor Cody Moser from the School of Predictive Intelligence. He's an expert in cognitive science and complex systems. And this session will be led by the best parameter of philosophy in discussion and break the best convergence we can have, Professor Raphael Yogier. Thank you so much for taking this session. And I will join you as well. My name is Manal Krouchi, and I'm computer scientist and AI professor at the School of Collective Intelligence. Thank you all.
Is it? Yeah.
I don't know.
What do you mean?
I mean that we are just sitting here. So if we are sitting here, we don't have to use mics, or do we have to use mics?
Yeah, I think we do have. I think we do have to use. So it's now we are going to have a little debate. I took some notes. I mean, I must say I took many notes, maybe too many notes. And I'm sorry if this debate, at least from my side, is going in a philosophical way. I mean, you can't heal yourself from your original disease. Just to start with you, Kerem, you were talking about Wittgenstein, and I think there is a little misinterpretation of the way you see what said Wittgenstein, because I think that Wittgenstein thinks that you can crack the code, but we don't give a shit about the code, because it's what he thinks. What he thinks is that you crack the code, but you will have another code. And you crack the code of the other code, you will have another code. And so you will always be with representation of representation of representation, so it doesn't matter. And what he will criticize, I think, in the cognitive science representation of the world is actually that it's possible to have an ultimate code that will give you what is reality, but because for him that doesn't mean anything to even talk about real in itself. It's why the last sentence said that basically, what you can talk about, you keep silent. It doesn't mean that everything is language for him. Well, some positivists, they thought about this way, etc. It doesn't mean that. It just means that reality is something that transcends not only the capacity, but the use of language. As you said, language is not made for that. It's just action, so it doesn't matter what encoding or something. Anyway.
No, I agree 100% with you. So I'm really sorry for students that we started with Wittgenstein. This is not really the right way to start this, but yes, I agree with you. So first of all, my understanding of Wittgenstein, you are right. So Wittgenstein is a mysterious actually figure. So he is interpreted actually dependent. So it's really mysterious, but that's the whole point. The whole point of cognitive neuroscience, the main cognitive neuroscience, the way it was actually formulated in the very beginning, is in the hope of cracking really the language of the brain.
Sure.
Right. So, and you are right. So the issue that Wittgenstein says in terms of really reality. So in the end, you cannot, because there are multiple layers for that reality. So the representation that can never catch that.
You can crack the language of the brain, but that doesn't mean that you will know more about what is reality. It's what means Wittgenstein, I think.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree. That's exactly that's true. So I'm using that analogy in this context because, and of course, I'm reducing a little bit the complexity by talking only about language in terms of syntax in the example that I used for the brain-machine interface. But still, the way actually I'm introducing the notion of the content is by saying that language is about content. Language it's about intentions. So the intentions themselves are so flexible, but even more from a neuroscientific perspective, for me, the intentions themselves, the code for the intentions is so flexible in the brain as well. So those are the last
Talking
slides,
about
basically.
talking about intention, just going in you talk about correlation, causation, teleology, and you say that's what is hard maybe to, AI to match the brain. My question will be, because it's something that preoccupies me, and I think that the main specificity of human being in particular is in fact not even correlation, causation, and theology, because I think even AI is able with theology, is the question of ego, desire, and complex. What do you have to say with that? Because I think it's ego, desire, complex, the fact that you feel frustrated and you project yourself as an ego is something that is more difficult to make into the AI. But I mean, AI is about optimization, with correlation and all that. But the thing with human beings that they don't optimize all the time. And because the ego, for instance, somebody is at a crossroad on I don't know, there is, a red light or something, and he can risk his survival, so it's not optimization, just because he feels insulted. It's not optimization at all. So I mean, don't you think that the most difficult things to implant or in AI is this question of desire, complex, ego, these kind of things, more than pure teleology? Because if human beings, they pretend they think in terms of teleology, but it's just an afterwards explanation of their behavior, because their basic behavior is not about that when you observe it.
Well, yeah, I think, I cannot say no to what you are saying, because indeed, so that ego is playing a role for sure in the way we actually think, but that does not, from my point of view, that does not rule out the agency that we have. The agency is also crucial. So I illustrated this by the example of basically why I'm here. You see, so why I'm here. So it can be a lot of stuff. It can be related to ego. You are right. So it can be related to ego. So, but is that really what's really going on in terms of the representation that I have in order to answer the question why I'm here? So again, so it's.
Yeah, but you think you don't think it's central. I think it's central. I think the ego is.
It is central. So it is central for sure. But again, in what context that is central? I would say. Yeah, I would just contextualize it. I would say, in what context that is central? Maybe in certain contexts it is, when my life is threatened.
Cody, I felt that you wanted to say something, and after, well.
Yeah, I think in part what you're getting at with the ego point is kind of the role of motivation, or you could think about it in terms of something like goal setting, right? Something that humans have a capacity for, but that we kind of have to give to AI, right? I think one thing that's important to remember, which is a very trivial point, but one which I think explains a lot, is what the brain is made of, which is entirely different from what artificial intelligences are made of, right? So David Marr, kind of the one of the founding idea makers in cognitive science, thought that we should think about information processing systems on at least 3 levels. On one level, you have the lowest level, which is the implementation. What is the hardware of the system? In the case of humans, it's neurons. In the case of artificial intelligence, right, it's microprocessors and so on. You have algorithm, which are the rules that are actually used by the system. This seems to be where most people try to make comparisons between AI and neural processes. And then you have computation, which is more or less the Aristotelian final causation, or the teleology of the system. What is it designed to do? But I think one core difference is that in the case of humans, even the implementation is teleological in its goal setting. So what is the purpose of a neuron? You can ask this, right? You could say, well, it's to activate when it receives a signal, or to tell others that it's going to send a signal and so on, but that's actually a false answer. The purpose of a neuron is to survive as an individual cell and receive energy to maintain its own homeostatic processes, right? It has its own goals. And from 86 billion neurons, there's this complex, massive game theoretic problem of how do you solve this coordination between each other And the coordination solution is effectively you build a mind. So even at the very bottom level, in the human case, there's goal setting happening. Somehow it's multiscalar, but eventually I think that thinking about the implementation more might see a little bit more in terms of coming up with answers about the human agential process versus what we see in AI.
Yeah. Yeah, I take the advantage of what you just said to tell people that if they want to have a discussion about this specific point, they can go this afternoon at ASNI Amphitheater, where the chair of transition will open the debate on goal-directedness. So, because we participated in a grant, unsuccessful grant on the subject.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to push back also in the interest of debate a little bit on these things, because in a sense, I don't see a strong difference between, I mean, clearly we have goals, or we also experience goals, etc. But these are also, I mean, in a sense, they are given to us to some degree by evolution, right? And there's a variety of goals that live on different scales, time scales, etc. And all of that combined makes it all feel to us quite humanly unique, etc. But I don't really see a strong divide. So I'd be curious to hear why you think, yeah, what the big difference is. I think machines can also be imbued with things like curiosity, sampling. So you could, in principle, install similar drives, I believe, in machines to humans. I don't see a conceptual or a non-bridgeable difference in a sense.
Yeah, I think there is an unbridgeable difference. But maybe it will put us into some kind of a debate that will like go away from, because one, for me, the difference between the machine and like the human, I don't even talk about the brain, because I think the entire body is a brain. I don't believe in like the specific, so it's another story. But I think it is, in fact, about optimizations. Like when you program a machine, you program it to optimize. And even if you program an ego in the machine, you have to imitate the human ego, and it will optimize the very concept that you put about the ego, so it will not be an ego again. What I'm saying is, it's the idea of this feeling of incompleteness in human being coming from neoteny, and this kind of thing that makes human beings being the most fragile animal, and feeling this fragility, it has the desire to complete itself, so to be more than what it is. It's the idea of ego, so it's real complex. And I always say in my talks that before being the more complex animal, which human beings weren't at the beginning, even in the brain way. If the brain became more complex, it's because at first they are complexed. So there is this complex is related to the ego, and the ego is the opposite of optimization. Because, for instance, let's take an example. Just a little example. There is a distance, so it's a problem to go to the moon. There is a distance from the Earth to the moon, right? There is no advantage at first, a priori, for human beings to invest energy, money, finance, everything to go to the moon. Why do you go there? It doesn't solve any problem. So it doesn't solve problema in Greek, an obstacle. At the beginning, no.
I don't agree. Yeah.
No, but it doesn't solve any problem a priori. The important word is a priori. Because human beings didn't face, it's because they faced a problem for their survival or their comfort that they went to the moon. You can't not agree with that. It's not because like, oh, we are going to the moon because we don't have enough to eat. It's not because that.
It solves an exploration problem, not an exploitation problem.
Exactly, but exploration problem is what? It's about ego. Because when you went to the moon, you say, oh, one little step for human and a big step for humanity, so it's a question of ego. So again, let's talk about something else. Why human beings, they cross the Atlantic and they say they will cross on their own? Oh, is it because they want to solve a problem for food, for comfort, for that? No, it's not. But I don't mean that a posteriori, when they have done that, they get a new perspective that they couldn't predict, and this new perspective will make them jump on a cognitive point of view. But at first, it's not motivated with the optimization itself of the first layer of design, that is the desire to survive, like the cell, like the brain cell. And it's not even motivated with the desire, what I call the desire to live, so comfort, this kind of thing. It's motivated like, I want to be, because I want to be more than what I am, etc., etc. I think these, for me, it's impossible to. I think it's what I see the limit with the computer, with the artificial intelligence. It's like if you have ping pong. What is ping pong? It's a set of rules. So it's you are creating obstacles. Like the net is an obstacle. You are creating the obstacle, and when you have those rules, you have the AI that will play with you. The AI will win. That's for sure, because it's about optimization. And we know that it will win right from the start. You know that it will win. Maybe it doesn't win right away, but it will win because it will correlate a more important number of data. And at the end, it will win according to the rules. But you will, when you invented ping pong, you invented obstacles. Inventing obstacles when the obstacle is not there, like the very idea of the game, is not about optimization. So that means human beings, they will say, oh, let's invent another game. So let's have pain and feel good about this pain because I've won against someone else. I think it is that you can't implement in machines. My way.
Yeah, no, I think what you're describing is an exploration. So I think coming up with obstacles, and often this exploration is in the service of creating world models, like creating models of the world and agents around it. And I think humans are extremely good at that. They are probably therefore better able to anticipate other humans and other animals better than other animals, right? This is our distinctive edge, I think. Now, this is something that I, again, don't think will be uniquely human. There is no magical source in us. It's
I don't think about magics.
No, right. But then the alternative to that is that it's, I mean, we are in the end, I would say, a biological machine that has this amazing capacity for building world models and exploration. But these are motives that are indeed understandable and also can be implementable in artificial neural networks.
But you know, when you say a biological machine, for a philosopher like me, I will say, yeah, but why do you need to add biological? So what means biological? If you add it, that means something specific, and I'm not sure you can say exactly what it is.
No, I don't think there's anything special about biology.
Yeah,
we are a machine. We just happen to be a meat machine, but it could be anything else. So you get rid of
biological?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Yeah. That's what I wanted to know about it. I don't, but yeah. Go.
Yeah, so I find myself agreeing with the notion of ego, at the same time agreeing with Flores about the idea of...
so that's good. You are a man of compromise.
Yeah,
so
I agree with the idea of ego if you really stretch that concept to include things that are not normally seen in the animal kingdom. For example, you would have to include things, for example, in which humans are even able to kill themselves in order to achieve goal objectives.
Yeah, that's what I call the desire to be, that could be against the survival itself.
Exactly. So in this case, yes, in this case, I think cognitive neuroscience can really fit this very well by simply emphasizing the concept of representation. The brain is a biological machine that is representational. The key point, I think, that makes the difference, and you can tell me your points about this, is what kind of informations are represented. I believe the difference would be, again, pointing to associative cortical areas and premotor areas, is in the abstract versus the material. The more abstract the notion is, and if it is capable to be actually computed, the more egoistic the humans will be, the more goal-directed the humans will be, and the more easy for us to deal with it, the more easy for us to compute, the more easy for us to predict. That's my takeout. So it's about the software. Yeah. That's what I believe. I believe it's the software, what's the difference. A rat, you can teach a rat actually to navigate in a maze.
Yeah. There are many difficult questions, in fact, in just what you said in the sentence itself. Yeah. Because just the fact that we pronounce the word abstract, does that mean that it's not material? And how is that even possible? There is something not material. You will say, oh, no, it's a machine, so everything is material. I think, even Daniel Dennett, with whom we talked here, has a hard time to define what he means when he says that the brain is just a digestion process. It was
maybe because it is difficult. Because maybe it is intrinsically difficult to define.
Yeah.
Right. So so Newton, when he
we work with representation even when we are scientists.
Yeah, exactly. So Newton, just as an analogy, Newton, when he described the gravitational processes, just to remind you, as he was accused as a blasphemer.
Sure.
Because simply at that time, where the mechanical philosophy was really spreading, so for them, gravitation, it's like magic. It's like resuscitating the concepts of magic to explain observable things. I believe the same thing with the mind.
Yeah. But I mean, it was a little bit magical what he was saying at the time that was resolved afterwards, because he was creating some kind of a mathematical model, mathematical relations, not telling what is actually happening between the Earth and the moon. And he wasn't reasoning in terms of force, like real actual force and waves and things like that. There was something missing. So that's the reason why he was obliged to say, oh, that might be God, that is a mathematician or something. So,
I agree with that. So I agree. So that's a window that is still open. You can still believe that we can solve it.
So to come back a little bit to Flores, I was quite interested in what you were saying. And again, because I'm just a poor philosopher and not a scientist as you, I was thinking, oh, that's interesting, because what he was saying, I kind of feel that I've read it in Husserl, in phenomenology, when, for instance, Husserl's talk about retention, about this idea that the representation is like the memory, it's entirely determined. I mean, partly it's determined because what you retain, retention, and what is called after protension will be like prediction. Like everything is, the perception itself, the representation itself is directly determined by the fact that you expect something. So there is this process of retention, protension, and in the middle of it, the question of surprise. He's talking a little bit about that. So the difference will be that, in my view, like very superficially when I listened to you and I was very interested, is that it's like if it was a phenomenological quantification. You added quantification, like which, of course, Husserl couldn't do. Would you agree with that? I mean, I don't want to.
Yeah, well, I think the ideas behind what I was showing today are very old indeed. I think also in the realm of perception, people like Helmholtz have been already viewing perception as a form of unconscious inference from sort of to try to find the causes that best explain the data that impinges on the sensorium. So I think those ideas are go back at least a century, probably even earlier. Okay. So I think where the progress has been made in science over the past decades is more at the algorithmic level. So Karim was describing the different levels of MAR. I think the algorithmic level, so which kind of algorithms can actually effectuate that computation. There's been progress there, and at the implementational level. So I think that's where, that's what I think was the contribution that I also shared today.
And Karim, you said that in a way, it's maybe I misunderstood, but that AI could be at a crossroad, working like in pure specialized correlation, or working like the brain, like association. So do you think it's possible to make AI work on an association level, on high general association level, will be like the general AI we are talking about?
No, for this, I'm really an unpersist person. So I'm really an agnostic towards whether it will be possible or not. So for me, I'm following the evidence for this.
Yeah, sure.
So I am really open-minded for this, but I do keep my critical mindset when I'm actually reading these kind of things. So an example, just to link it to what Flores said about prediction. So prediction, so dopamine system, you already mentioned it. So dopaminergic neurons, the way they fire in relation to learning. So it's actually one of the most successful example of reinforcement learning. And a lot of these AIs are taking inputs from this in order to feed, in order to really just make agents, it makes systems actually agent systems using reinforcement learning. So I believe this has a huge potential. And it has already shown a huge potential in really making things actually meaningful, making systems meaningful. An example of this, just published recently by Meta. I just saw this actually 2-3 days ago.
You saw so many things 2-3 years ago.
No, no, yeah, because I prepared this actually last minute. So, a model that they just developed, this is a foundational model, that is really successful in predicting the messages from images and audio. Again, referring to the nature of the inputs we are getting. They are getting pictures and they are getting audio, and from this, they really can do a huge. I mean, the models, they are really successful in really predicting even the content of the experience. So yes, it is possible. I'm not saying it's not possible, but to what extent this AI can capture the variability and diversity of the factors. That's why I refer to the idea of the chaos that Wittgenstein. So to what extent? So how much computational power do we need, and do we have it? And is it theoretically possible that will handle such large data of information to come up with reliable models? That in a context that where the predictability is possible. I'm not even talking about in context where the predictability is chaotic, as you said.
But there is also the question of there is also the question of content that you were talking at the end. The question of content, as like you said, like could AI help with content? But now I could ask a question that is a little bit provocative for you cognitive scientists, is that does cognitive science works with content?
What do you think,
not only with procedures, forms, representation, and things like that. Just sorry about that. if it is provocative to say that.
Yeah, you have to help me understand the question.
Yeah, but it's just the idea that when he talks about content, I didn't. Right? I did that. Just listen very carefully, like a nice pupil, you know. And he said, like, oh, with AI, maybe AI could help with content, but maybe not, or something like that. It's not possible. So right away, my tendency was to say exactly what does that mean, content. So that's the reason why I was asking myself, what does he mean with content? And my second question was, whatever that means, does cognitive science work with content? You know, so that's actually, I leave the question open.
Yeah, okay. Without much context, I'm not really sure how to answer this. So I mean, clearly we know that you can retrieve very specific experiences. You can recreate very specific subjective experiences by, for example, stimulating specific neuronal populations. So there is clearly a link between experience certain contents, I would say, and neural activity. So. So I'm not really sure what part you're questioning.
Okay, there is in theory of knowledge, as you know, and theory of the mind and things like that, this famous idea and but very controversial and everything of qualia. When we talk about content, we talk about qualia. And some people said, when you do cognitive science or even AI and that aspect, that's the same, you never talk about qualia. You talk about like procedures, even when you pronounce the word experience, you're not talking about the content of the experience, like the subjective experience itself will not be rich. You know, it is this idea of qualia. Can we talk about supposed to be like qualitative content?
Yeah, no, so again, so when Penfield was nicely referenced already, when he was stimulating specific neurons that generated specific qualia. So I don't think there is anything mysterious really there. It's qualia are to me just sort of like consciously accessible representations. So and clearly not everything is consciously accessible. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the brain that we are not aware of, so that do not generate qualia, but at the same time, obviously, there is some things that we want to be consciously accessible because we want to communicate about them, we want to build upon them, etc. And those would be what I would refer to as qualia. But for instance,
what I want to mean, like to try to precise a little bit the question, even if I don't agree with the idea of qualia in the way it is usually put on in a debate, but let's take it this way. When you were talking, Karim, about inner speech and attempt speech, if I have, and one moment you said something, and right away I grabbed what you said. So, oh, he thinks it's obvious, but for me it's not obvious. What you just said, he said, when I have my inner speech and I'm doing that, and say, I don't want that to be known. Where does it come from? Because is it part of the representation of what you don't want to be? No. So what interests me will be like, what is this? I don't want that to be known.
Okay, for me, from a neuroscientific perspective, what that means, it simply means an engram that is actually activated, but not actualized, not externalized. All right, so that's all, from a neuroscientific perspective, that's enough for me. So that's what it means. And the question is it possible to actually know about that? So that's really what I referenced there. So
Okay.
I mean, this is not really about qualia. So this question is not really about qualia.
No, it's not really about qualia. But for me, well, that's the reason why I said I don't agree with the qualia thing.
Yes.
But it seems to me that it's kind of a limit at this stage of science, at least, of the possible explanation like this. I don't want that to be known. We can see that. We can see that. Yes.
Yeah.
The part that we don't want to be known, we can talk about it because there's the brains and like it's there. You have the inner speech and it's obvious, etc. But these thing that say, oh, I don't want these to be known. That seems to me a limit of the explanation is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I got your point. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I think it's kind of the same point about content, right? Which is it may actually just be the case that cognitive science has convinced itself that it's talking about content when really it isn't. I wonder at times when we're looking at things like brain signatures, if what we're trying to do is we're asking, where is it that this car is trying to go by deconstructing the engine and pulling out its parts, right? You're not going to get that much information about the agential property of the car, which has a person or a self sitting inside of it. You can learn about the mechanisms, right? When the wheel turns left, the car is going to go left, it's going to go right. Perhaps it even has a GPS in terms of like, predictive play cells or something telling you where perhaps it might prefer to go, but it doesn't tell you much about the system in sense driving the car. Now, you could say, what Cody's saying here is that maybe there's some kind of immaterial force that he's referring to. And I wouldn't necessarily deny that objection. I think that one framing that you could take is that instead of viewing systems as algorithms, which in an Aristotelian notion are complete, they're self-sufficient for their own description, actual human minds are incomplete. They're kind of moving towards something that isn't necessarily already delimited for them. And one way that people have started thinking about this more and more is thinking about mind more as process than as algorithm. That if you think about what the mind is, it's actually more like, waves moving on water than it is about a set of specific instructions, right? Now the waves might go ahead and refer to instructions, which are, basically placed in our neural architecture, but there may be something more immaterial in a sense, not to say non-physical, but less material than some of the ways that we're currently thinking about mind in place right now.
There is this current, and there was even a big book written about this, like process biology. Maybe you're into this. Is there a process cognitive science or something like that? Like these tendency exists in cognitive science because I know about process philosophy, of course, because I've worked on that. I mean, I'm come from process philosophy perspective, and now I know that there is this idea of process biology. There have been plenty of articles written on that, and do you have in the cognitive science milieu some kind of people that are going in this direction? Seems you are going in this direction.
Yes, I'm wondering if emergence is a basically term.
Yeah.
yeah, that's something that is very, people are very aware of. Yeah, so I think part of understanding a system is taking it apart and studying its pieces. But clearly, that doesn't give you the whole story. You also need to then understand how the process emerges from the specific interactions. And I think that's exactly what cognitive neuroscience is trying to do.
The idea of autopoietic system, how it becomes metabolic, and so the idea that, as you said, like it does things simultaneously, and in fact, this simultaneity is not exactly simultaneous. It's the process itself that creates the ensemble is reproducing itself. Right.
I think that's where AI is actually, again, fascinating in the sense that we have a system that at some level we understand completely, right? I mean, we know exactly how many neurons there are, how they're connected, the activation rules, the data, everything is fully understood. Yet at another level, we are really in the dark, where I think many people have no idea why they are hallucinating so much,
exactly.
or etc. So I think this is, again, an emergent property, not always a desirable emergent property.
But now,
So let me finish, because that's, I think, exactly where I would go also with things like ego and all those kind of things that you started out with. Those are emergent properties that can emanate from artificial just as well as from biological systems, and I don't see a big divide there.
And part of the scientific objective of the chair of transitions, it's actually to criticize even the concept of emergence, to say it seems that there is something missing about the very concept of emergence, and we'll talk about that this afternoon again, just to advertise it.
All right. So, Floris, I have a question in relation to this prediction, the predictive brain. So, you in your talk, you really nicely mentioned that even the predictability, the inference of predictability from different layers, from you used the example of the inferior temporal cortex, and you said that different messages actually are actually getting from different areas. So different predictive errors, let's call them, are coming from different areas. So and then immediately I thought about there's a work that actually was done, I think in Picower lab in MIT, in which they tried indeed to decorticate the encoding of the prediction error from the dopamine system. So basically, the dopamine system projects to a lot of areas, and then the idea is the code for the predictive error code, is it actually localized at the level of the dopaminergic neurons at the origin, or is it widespread in different brain areas that are receiving these dopaminergic neurons? And immediately I said, okay, maybe there's a link there, because what they found in that study indeed is that it is actually it is not local, but it is widespread. It is distributed. So we are talking in that case of a network encoding of the prediction. Yeah. So I don't know if
Absolutely.
you can link.
Yeah. No, I think. Can I?
It's interesting. Yeah. Go.
Yeah. No. So that I think that's absolutely true. So I think predictions probably live at, again, different timescales, different implementations are there for different timescales and different types of errors. But I think the example I gave, I completely agree with you, is quite, it's quite possible that the dopamine system here will kind of be a region here that gets a salient signal, like perhaps from higher visual cortex, which then kind of activates the whole brain. It's basically telling the organism, there is something here that is different from what I expect in a relevant way. Please pay more attention because we need to encode a new memory. And indeed, the dopamine system is also quite linked to the hippocampus. So whenever something surprising happens, it can be intrinsically rewarding, interestingly enough. So we like surprises sometimes, right? It's like, oh, this is something. That's why we become scientists, in a sense. And it triggers the formation of a new memory trace. Yeah.
No, but that's very nice. But what really fascinated me in that study is that the idea of the fact that it is distributed. And it is distributed not in a copy-paste way. It's distributed in different components are encoded in different areas. Mm-hmm. So that was a challenge, and this actually then will lead to the idea of again related to philosophy, the idea of how can you combine it. Mm-hmm. So do we have to suppose that there is a kind of pineal gland that combines all of them? Mm-hmm. Yeah, or is it just how it is, and we don't know? We don't know really how the predictive signal is encoded in the end. Right. So we know that it is encoded, of course, distributed, but the way it is encoded in the end in order to shape the behavior, the outcome, we know it does that, but the way it is done, So
Yeah, no, so I think some theories would state that if the theories arise at all, or predictions, sorry, arise at all levels, potentially, of the cortical hierarchy, and when a prediction error can be solved at a low level, it will be done there and it won't percolate further up. If it cannot be solved, it will keep percolating up, and so that the last place it will percolate to is, in that sense, again, the stratum and the hippocampus. So for things that are not basically explained away by what we already know, you will create a new memory and you will pay attention to it.
Interesting. Manal, you wanted to say something?
Does it work now?
Yeah, that works. That's what.
Well, I was supposedly to be like a panelist and discussant, but I cannot stop myself from asking a lot of questions. So I switched my role again
Great,
and asking questions.
Go for it.
But I will go with the audience if they have.
Because you're the only woman, so it's
Yeah,
you have.
I have a lot of questions, especially with all these topics to be conversed. But I will start first with the audience if they have any questions, and then we'll come back to my questions again. Yes, Brent.
No, do you don't want to ask her?
Hi, thanks for all the interesting presentations. This question is for Floris. So I really liked everything that you presented. And this is it's not just about this talk. This is like a long-standing question that I've had about this prediction theory. So it's like when I look at the work that you did that you showed on vision, and you were kind of equating violation of expectation with prediction error. Like if there's a violation of expectation, then there was a prediction error. But I don't think that that has to be the case. So like for me, and I think the semantics matter a little bit. So like for me, a prediction implies a representation of the future. Whereas if you have a violation of expectation, that's not strictly required. So you could have for example, imagine a partially occluded object where you infer, in my language, like Helmholtzian, inference in the visual cortex, you infer the presence of the missing part of the object. From that inference, you could form a prediction. You could make a conditional prediction, like if I were to remove the occluding screen, then I would see this. But I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. And I think that's different than, and for me, I think a lot of what you're calling prediction, I think of that as just inference, as opposed to something that's forward-looking. Inference would just be I'm inferring characteristics of a scene or characteristics of an object. And I think that might be different than the language case. I think for the language case, the nature of, I think I'm more convinced that there probably is something like prediction happening in those cases where you see the string of letters or the string of words, and then I think the brain probably does form a prediction where if the word didn't come at the right time, then you would probably get like an N400 type response. So I'm just wondering, I just wonder what you have to say about that. And this is again, it's not like directly at you. I think this is a more general thing in the field, but like inference versus prediction, specifically.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, and I think the word prediction, it can mean a lot of different things in different contexts, right? So that's, I think, so my main answer here would be that you can apply the concept of prediction to an agent, which is perhaps the level at which you apply it now, so that you as a sort of an organism or as an agent are sort of maybe even consciously predicting next words as the words come in, etc. So in that language, or in that use of the term, I would agree with you that it's not so likely that in a case of occlusion that you're really like forming conscious predictions about like, okay, what's behind the...
Well, not even the word, I wouldn't even use the word conscious. Like I think that you can have, implicit prediction as well, but where I think what's crucial is that if it's like truly a prediction, there's a representation of the future. It's like there's a representation of a future timestamp and something associated with that timestamp. And that doesn't have to be conscious in the way that I'm thinking about it.
You could broaden it up, though, a little bit to say that the prediction is basically an extrapolation into the unknown. So the unknown could be the future, and that's indeed, again, how people often think about prediction, that you make a prediction about the future. But especially in the visual system, there's also a lot of spatial predictability, right? Where the scene, the examples that I gave partly as well, where the scene kind of contextualizes the object within the scene. So there is no temporal aspect of prediction whatsoever. So in that sense, I think I have definitely used sort of like a broader version of the concept of prediction, where it can also actually be applied to modules within our brain rather than the cognitive machine, the agent in its entirety. So I think.
So yeah. So just like final point, and then I'll give it to the microphone.
Great.
Is that I think that the reason why I think it matters, because you could just say, well, it's just a terminological thing, it doesn't really matter that much. The reason why I think it matters is that if you use the word prediction in this broad sense, it suggests that there's something fundamentally similar happening, say, in language processing and visual processing, et cetera, where it could be that those are just very different types of processes. One is a more retrospective type of process. Okay, I have this information and I'm forming a representation of a scene, and I can be surprised when something is violated, but it's not a prediction in the same sense that what you're doing in language or what you're doing in conscious processing. So I think there's a danger of masking by using the same word. I think there's a danger of masking a variety of different types of processes that might not all fit under the same umbrella.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting thought. Or I will, after this session, we could come back to it. But I think indeed, the term prediction has some ambiguity in it. I can completely agree with that. And how it plays out exactly within the different domains of perception and language there's probably going to be some commonalities, but clearly also some difference. I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Manal,
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I want to add something because it's a very important point about the prediction. And I have a question to all our panelists, starting with you, Raphael, because talking about prediction and inference, is it about future or is it about lack of information that we couldn't know this future? And what is the difference between predicting and or foreseeing related to what are we discussing? Starting with you, Raphael.
Yeah, I mean, my answer will be very much related to what I said before, and I'm afraid I will not satisfy really cognitive scientists on that aspect, because I think first the future does not exist. I start with, so what will it be? It's interesting because in English, when you want, because you are talking about language, when you want to manifest the future, unlike French, which is a very abstract language, when you want to say something about the future, you put will. I will go, which means I want, in fact. So just to say that for me, the future is just about projection, just about desire. So it's directly related. I'm very much into phenomenology. It's very well related into the tension between retention, what was like memories that were represented. And so I expect something to happen. And so for instance, when I'm looking at the door, if I'm able to, in a phenomenological point of view, if I'm able to see the door, I will not even see the door, according to Husserl. If I'm even able to see the door, it's because right away I'm feeling protension, that there is a corridor behind it, so it has to have the function of the door, so therefore it's a door. But if I get closer and I see it's a picture, surprise, oh shit, it's a picture of a door, it's not really a door, right away I will again put it into other kind of memory that, oh, when I see a picture, I have to expect, etc., etc., etc. And so inside all that, there is my projection with my need, survival, comfort, and the one that at the top, what I call the desire to be, which is my ego. I want to be someone, I want to be seen, I want to be recognized, etc. And so I project according to what I see around the door, etc., I project like, yes, I need to go there, I need to say that, I need, and it's what makes the future being what it is for me. It's what makes the future. Now, maybe it's a little bit confusing the way I'm putting it, but it's the way I see it. So maybe the other.
Yeah, I kind of like the way that you put it, tying it into things like desire, right? Like if you go back to Plato and you read like Protagoras or the Nicomachean Ethics with Aristotle, right? What they were talking is, how do you get a virtuous person, right? And they say oftentimes it comes down to a knowledge of fact, that you end up with bad preferences because you're not able to predict how the good ones outweigh the better ones or the bad ones, right? And and every time I read that, I feel like what I'm looking at is temporal difference learning from reinforcement learning. You know, they're talking about very old algorithms in this classical language. That at the time they didn't really have a way of thinking about, but they really did think that cognition worked in this way. So I think that's just to say that this idea about desire and prediction are kind of tied up with each other, and is something that a lot of people have thought about for a very long time.
Okay, so if I understood your question, Manal, very well. So as a neuroscientist, so I would try to answer it from a neuroscientist perspective. So about the future. So there is uncertainty, future. So whether I believe in the future or not, it's completely irrelevant in this kind. So what matters here, does the brain really encode information about the future, about uncertainty? You said lack of information. Is it because we are lacking information? So from this perspective, yes, the brain does encode uncertainty levels about projecting to the future. And even potential scenarios in the future, they are shown to impact the behavior. So even if we don't believe in the future, the brain computes it. And behavior is shaped by our predictions and our projections. What do we expect? So yeah, it is there, even if you don't believe
anxiety.
in it.
Sometimes it's anxiety that it actually projects.
Sometimes
the fact that it is uncertain, the projection of the future, it creates anxiety.
Well, yeah, of course, it creates surprise. Let's put it like this: it creates surprise, either positive, negative, whatever. So it's, but yeah, it is. And in relation to dopamine, just to link it with dopamine again system. So recently, a paper in which they asked the fundamental question whether dopamine system is actually involved in encoding anterograd or retrograd learning. So if I'm associating two things. Is it that I am collecting a lot of information, a lot of stimuli, I am putting them back in the background, and I'm trying to associate them, and then learn from these associations and and then behavior, and then learning happens. So in this case, the idea is that you should have a kind of a large memory in which you should be able to store all these kind of potential associations, potential variabilities that happen, and then assign value to them, and then they will shape the learning. So the other alternative is retrograde learning, in which case you don't do this. The brain does not do all of this, does not have the capacity to represent all of this information, simply because the buffer system is so limited. But the way the brain does this is, whenever you encounter surprise, you go a little bit backwards and try to see what was the factor that was close to the event that led to that surprise. And then it creates the association and then shapes the behavior. So yeah, of course, it is possible. The projections, they are encoded, they are affecting the behavior. The way they are doing this is still really an open question for science. So that's how I look at it. So for me, it's a really empirical way how the brain really represents all these kind of phenomena.
Yeah. So to very briefly add, it was mentioned that the future doesn't exist. Perhaps at the same time, I guess it seems adaptive to consider it. I think I think the examples you gave also of space, I think there are some beautiful examples there. There is a so-called, for example, successor representation. So I think many people now think that these place cells are not just representing locations in space, as they originally thought they were, but they are very much sort of in the service also of like the goals. So where you want to, if there are certain goals, then they'll be skewed towards that. And they can be thought of as sort of like a representation of the future. So a temporarily discounted representation of future states that you will occupy or that you're expected to occupy. Yeah, exactly. And that's fantastic for planning. So it's a very nice way or a nice representation in the service of an animal's goal. So I think and there I think particularly humans have this capacity to get themselves out of the present and think about either the past or plan hypothetical futures. And I think this is we can simulate things that we've never seen, that we can combine the past into the future. And that I think is one of the ways in which we can sort of why we're so successful. I think this mental simulations are a strategy that allows us to kind of like not go into dangerous paths by simulating them.
In my language, I will say that humans are able to project their desire so far that it becomes successful because they use their current representation to project their desire so far and to see the different path possibilities and things like that.
I agree.
You wanted to say something else? No?
No, I have another question, but I will ask the audience if they have a question, or shall I ask mine?
Well, you can ask a question too. I mean,
While waiting.
if the audience wants to, now it's kind of a free debate.
Yeah.
I even say sometimes that I don't really like this idea of Q&A. I think we have to change that. It's just we are talking, and after people comment, they are talking, and they also are agents of the debate.
So I just didn't. There was this idea that the future doesn't exist. That could you explain that a little bit? Like that just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, but just what I'm saying is the future is a pure construct of what I want to happen or what I don't want to happen. So that's the reason why I was saying it's directly related to my desire, and that's the reason why. Like we have this when we. I mean, it will go very far, but when we talk about the fear of death, for instance, that seems to be something very typically human, not completely, but at least there is something very specific about it. It's just a projection of what is supposed to be the future, or what is supposed to be, a stop of the future.
Like, what would you say about like calendars?
Yeah, it's actually a projection of representation of what cycles that you have already lived, and you expect those cycles to be to happen again. And it's your collective desire to be able to be in time at the meeting you want to have next week. So you create the idea of next week to be able to say that I'm going to be more efficient. In fact. If I don't have a calendar, I can't be efficient. If I don't have, as Bergson will put it, when we are talking about time, usually we think we're talking about time, but we are talking about space because it's the place of the arrow on our watch that does a certain part of time. But in fact, real time is just about intensity, and I will add intensity of my desire for something to happen and to have some kind of an experience and to relate to something I've already lived and I would like to live again, or maybe I would not want to live again, and I construct my idea of a future according to what I don't want to live and what I want to live and where I want to go, etc., etc. And death is just the end result of this projection for me.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So I have a question for Floris. We were talking about the AI as a tool to understand the mind and the brain. And we know that AI started in the early days from the neural network for understanding the brain. Now AI is trying to understand the brain. But both of them are like black boxes. Like somehow we couldn't understand fully how the brain works. Same for neural networks and large language models. Do you think we can come to a day in the future where, despite not knowing exactly what's going on in the brain, AI will be independent and strong enough to shape our cognitive behavior in the future?
Right. Yeah. So great question. So I'll start with the black boxes because I agree that to some degree, and this is related to what I said earlier, we understand completely what they are, right? So you can open the black box, you can look at every single weight, etc. But at another level, you might say, well, we don't really understand it sort of at the level that we like to understand things. And I think in the old days, like people would say, like, oh, V1 likes edges, V2 likes maybe conjunction of edges, V4 likes colors, IT likes faces. You know, that we had all these nice verbal labels that we would put on our neurons, right? And we would that's how we would understand the neurons or the link between the neurons and the concept in the world. And I think that's probably an oversimplification. I mean, we already know that neurons can be tuned to very different things at the same time, which is a little bit weird. I mean, why would that be if it's just like a single label? And I think what AI is actually sort of teaching us to some degree is that that there is maybe not such a nice, pleasing verbal label that we can put on all these different layers. So if we take an AlexNet, what is layer 4 doing, or what is layer 6 doing? Well, we can't verbalize that in a very simple way. We can verbalize it at the very beginning, we can verbalize it at the very end, right? At the end, it's a category label, and in the beginning, it's pixels. What happens in between is a transformation from pixels to categories. We can sort of see those transformations. I think those same transformations are happening in the brain. So there, I think maybe we ultimately have to let go of verbal labels, and we have to kind of just live with the fact that they are not sort of describable by the simple language that we use. So that's I think maybe also a gain. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree 100%. This is really probably the pragmatic way to look at it, except that that we know that the way actually things are represented, and I'm talking about the brain, the way things are represented impacts the behavior. So I like to use a lot of examples. For example, the idea of free will, the notion of free will. So imagine this notion, it has a lot of abstract concepts in it, so we can actually decorticate actually what it is, and then we can even find, let's say, representations of it actually in the brain. But what's really fascinating is the psychological part of it, in which that depending on how you believe, whether we have free will or not, you will behave in a certain way. So in a way, yes, of course, we can get rid of all these concepts because, yeah, they are confusing, we cannot resolve them, they are black boxes, we cannot know them. But the fact that they have an impact on us and on our society just pushes us back to reconsider that we are kind of stuck. So we should not really deal with them that much, but we have to deal with them that much because they are influential. So that's why I ended my presentation with the idea of action. That's where actually Wittgenstein comes in. In the end, it's basically action. So yeah, you believe in this, you believe in that, but in the end, it's really action. The action can shape actually what you think and how it is executed. So that's how I actually solve this, just in a very humble way, personal way. So.
Just a little thing, because by the time where I had the time to reflect a little bit on this idea the future does not exist, I'll say another way to say it is that the future is just about perspective. The word perspective is interesting. It's just about perspective. And cognitive science, I think it can mean something. Like it's just you have a perspective. Like you look at the door, the future is you have this desire to cross this door and to go somewhere else. So the future is something that you add according to your past representation towards what you want to do, but it doesn't exist in the sense that it's just the perspective itself. And so for me, death, as Epicure will put it, it's say, why do we talk about death? Because basically death does not exist at all. Because when we are die, it doesn't have anything to do with us because we are dead. And when we are not dead, it doesn't have anything to do either because we are not dead. So what is it about? And so I use this little sentence that sounds like very obvious to say, so that means that death is just about perspective. And it's about, in fact, the loss of perspective and the fear that we are losing the perspective. So basically, it's about uncertainty. That's the reason why I always say death is actually the dead angle. You know, it's actually that angle is the fact that you think that there is some kind of, and I think science, the very project of science is to try to fill the dead angle. In fact, to say, no, we can still have a perspective, you know what I mean? We can still have this perspective, so we can still have the future. That's the reason why science is directly related with the obsession of future progress. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you. I have a question for Karim regarding, you're talking about culture is impacting and motivation impacting the cognition. And AI especially said AI cannot be perfect because it lacks this theology and everything. Can you explain more about this? And I know really related also to Cody's work in complex systems, how communities and crowd and complex systems can shape our thinking and motivation, and also in cognition regarding AI, because we can see some cultures are different in behavior regarding, for example, the same LLM that we use. So if you start, Karim, and then Cody.
Okay, so there are two things there: culture, motivation. So when you talk about culture, so how does it impact our health? So yeah, of course, a lot of things are impacting actually the way we behave. In my domain, sleep, I mentioned the example of sleep. So the example of sleep is really telling, because the duration, that amount of sleep that you have, will impact directly your performances the next day. So how is it that in different cultures, different durations, and the duration that we consider to be experimentally really some pathological, for example, 6 hours. So 6 hours, it's really the limit of the amount of sleep that you need for your body to physiologically function properly.
Shit.
Yeah, 6 hours. Yeah, and it is plastic. So how is it that Japanese can actually make it? All right? So that's where motivation comes in. So you motivate them, all right? And if you motivate someone, you can enlarge the boundary of what is possible, okay? So, and the moment you mention motivation in cognitive neuroscience, it's a black box, okay? We link it with what? We link it with decision making. That's the closest we can get. We link it with decision making.
What we said already.
Yeah, we
were
already
trying
said
to
this.
say,
Exactly. Yeah, it's decision making, computational, and all that stuff, and then we make the analogy between it. All is good. I mean, yeah, I think we should not really underestimate AI, as you said, in its ability to come up with really fantastic actually outcomes in this direction. But I'm still having always my doubts whether it will be able to really grasp the panoply of what we call when we say intention and when we say motivation. That's where I have my issues. And I already gave the example of the multiplicity of our intentions. Okay, that's already enough to illustrate. It's not the most complex philosophically. It's not the most complex concept. There are much more complex than this. But this is already enough that I can understand as a neuroscientist in terms of how the brain computes these kind of imputations, and they can understand how, through actually predictions and algorithms that compute all potential scenarios, can impact behavior. And still, we are struggling. Still, we don't really know. So, to what extent AI can really do that, I keep it as an open question. I don't want to say yes, I don't want to say no. An agnostic, kind of an agnostic in this direction.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, culture is a weird one, right? You think about it as providing people with certain common dispositions that they share with others, right? So if you think about, things that, you come across in the real world, enter your mind, and they create some kind of metabolic process internally, right? So someone could say a word that in your culture would make you angry, but in other people's cultures would not. The same stimuli for different people, will have drastically different reactions. I think one of the best examples of this, I'm reminded of Paul Fletcher's work at Cambridge, is on, for example, schizophrenia or psychosis. So, right. Because I grew up in the West and I understand schizophrenia from, say, its medical foundations. If I start hearing voices tomorrow, it's going to trigger a feedback loop in which I tell myself I'm going crazy. I'm going to realize that I'm ill, something is, in a sense, wrong with my brain, and that is going to make me even sicker because it's going to create, some kind of anxiety loop, right? Traditional societies, or even you go back to Europe in medieval times, right? When people hear voices, it didn't have that negative valence added to it, right? You might be hearing spirits or people in your family, so on and so forth. It doesn't trigger this kind of fatalistic feedback loop that I would receive if I started hearing voices tomorroh.
It can be a chance or somehow, oh, that's great.
No, precisely.
Capacity or something.
Yeah. And so kind of just thinking about culture on this level, I think it's extremely powerful and is kind of an area that, with its relationship to neuroscience, is not fully developed yet.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting example. I think free will is actually another one where in the Middle Ages, people didn't experience free will to the same degree that we have now, right? So, or in the Greek times, I mean, then people were very comfortable with the idea that they were not free, that they did not have this. Yeah. So maybe coming back to the question also on like what AI doesn't have, and maybe I should also clarify that I think at the moment, many AI systems are lacking all kind of things and are different in all kind of ways from humans. I think the convolutional neural networks, they just have one purpose, which is to categorize input, for example, right? Or large language models, in their pre-training phase, they have one purpose, which is to predict the next token. So, and I think they can, what I think is interesting is how much can emanate from such simple objectives, such simple architectures. But obviously, they do not have intentionality or free will or all these kind of things that mark humans. I think there, if we put on our fantasy glasses and sort of like extrapolate, I don't see any issue why ultimately they wouldn't be able to have it. So I don't see any kind of fundamental reason for that. But at the same time, clearly, I think at the moment, they do not possess many capacities that we have. And there's also like the drives that we have, many of them, it wouldn't be very useful to put them in an AI, right? So I think there's also very clear reasons why they will probably never be like us, I think.
Cody?
Yeah, I love this point, and I think especially for people wanting to get into this stuff in the future, particularly, you know, students, I think right now we have these extremely strong model architectures for pulling out statistical data out of the world, right? But we're at a point now where if we want to start talking about meaningful things as they connect to mind in particular, it's about time that we get a little bit more creative and start thinking about AI that closes that action perception loop, that has some kind of risk in its existence and in the behaviors that it needs to facilitate that existence, right? You could think about, instead of just having static neural nodes, you could think about selfish nodes, you know, that are kind of negotiating what their activation patterns are going to be with each other, similar to like what our brain does now. I think in the future, what's going to happen is we're going to go back to the history of AI, and we're going to remember that it really never was about inference machines per se. You go back to early cybernetics, and it was also about homeostats, you know, systems that need to survive and have a purpose to survive. You know, eventually there was the Dartmouth conference and they started talking about AI in terms of inference machines. But I think eventually we're going to go back, we're going to re-loop this kind of new discovery we found to kind of the origins of this field. And I think that's really going to be the big future for making a more holistic version of AI that fits with how we think about cognition in general.
Yeah, but even when you see, when you said that if we come back to AI, what it was, and we could see that it was, at the end of the day, it was also to survive, like, that's the reason why I used this word in the beginning of our conversation of optimization. I think it will be hard. So maybe, okay, that it will be hard to imagine or to create, to have an AI where that will not optimize something, you know, like human beings don't optimize something, like they risk and like they sacrifice themselves in such a way that is really weird for their, what I call their desire to be, that could challenge their desire of comfort and even their desire to survive. And I think at one point or another, that will be hard to make AI get out of some kind of optimization, even if we decide to be a little bit tricky and to put like, okay, optimize to not optimize, like, or something like that. At the end of the day, I think it might be hard, and it's why I use the word desire more even than motivation, because motivation seems clear, and I know with cognitive science it's always like things seems clear, but when I'm talking about desire, I say it's not clear. Its desire could go against even something that is an obvious motivation. And we saw that recently in different ways in our societies with people that behave in a certain way that is against their own interest. Like, for instance, they will behave sexually in a different way, in a way that will jeopardize their entire career and other, you know. And so we can see that with human beings, this thing with desire, it goes way beyond any kind of what we could call, what would be optimized, and also what we will call motivation, if we think that motivation is something that is quite obvious and clear and everything. Sorry, I cut you.
And it fits very well with what I want to say, because I would link the notion of desire with ethics. Ethics also is another thing, so we did not talk that much about it. So even if, imagine we have these models, so do we really want, and again, another concept, do we really want to use them, for example, for educational purposes? Is it efficient to use them for ethical? And even if it's efficient, do we really want to do that? So that's another thing that I'm thinking about. It's so these dimensions, I think they are difficult, and they are always depending on goals. Because if the goal is optimization, I don't see any reason why you should not implement this in educational systems, because you can really come up with very fantastic results. But if our goal is to, for example, in the case of students' education, if our goal is to really build up thinking agents, maybe we should not. Maybe we should not do that, because clearly these AIs certainly will actually impact. The least they can do is to promote laziness.
Yeah.
That's the least they can do. They can do much more harm. So, okay, the question is, do we want to do this?
Yeah.
If you are talking about optimization, yes, I can really, yeah, students, they surprise me sometimes.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and then I said, oh my God, is this really high level? But then I realized that they used ChatGPT. And then,
Exactly.
and then I assure myself, I said, oh my God, yeah, okay, so it's not really that I thought. But you see the idea. So the idea is the ethical component as well is probably another dimension. So in terms of the usage of these kind of tools in order to
Yeah,
help.
and we even have to rethink what we mean by ethics through AI, in the face of AI. And it's not that obvious, actually.
Question, yeah.
And it's exactly my question that I wanted to ask. And I really want to ask this question to all of you and to see from your perspective. We have the first thing that you mentioned, Karim, which is ethics, which is not evident. And another challenge, which is already mentioned, hallucination and all this bias. And bias exists, we want it or not, despite all the innovation we have in AI. And it's not really a bug per se, but it's like a mirror that we don't like to see because by the end, it's generated by us. So from your perspective, to what extent can we avoid this bias so we can have good ethical AI in the future? So how we can converge to have the best version of AI that can, as Karim said, we can use it in education and trust our future generation with it.
Maybe we need to educate AI in a ethical way.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, a really important problem. I don't think I have any solution at hand. I think there is, I mean, in statistics, there's the bias variance trade-off, right? So in a sense, sometimes if you look at it from that sort of like clean, or from that statistical angle, you could say that sometimes bias can be good because it gives you a sort of a less variance in your estimate. But clearly there are domains where bias is always bad, even if it will reduce your variance, such as indeed in cases where you apply stereotypes. And I think there, I totally agree with you that the LLMs just soak up the prejudice and the biases that are already there, so they don't generate them, they just mirror them. So I guess maybe well-curated training data could be one potential way to try to reduce bias. So just like we're educating our societies, we need to educate the models as well. That would be.
Yeah, that's good. But I think we could ask actually even the question from do we really want to reduce bias? In some domains, you usually don't want to reduce bias. Yeah, in the medicine. So, for example, the placebo effect. Yeah, well, I don't really want to introduce bias. I really want my patient to take advantage of the placebo effect. Yeah, it's really part of the picture. So I don't want to reduce it. So again, context. It plays a role in exactly what do you want to feed in your models in order to help you predict or not predict. In relation to, I want to say this because otherwise you will tell me that you saw this again just 2 days or 3 days ago.
2 days ago again.
No, but I didn't read it well, to be honest with you. So it's actually a paper. Apparently, it's an application. I haven't read it well, to be honest. It's an application that is developed in order in the hospitals in order to reduce calls after operations. The idea is to optimize the taking care of patients after they visited the hospital. And they did that by feeding the models the data about patients. Okay, and then in the end, the model really did very well based on that. But in the end, when it was put on action in the field, it performed terribly bad. And then when they went back, and that's the part they haven't read well, when they went back, they noticed that the things that were responsible for the failure of this model is that they could not they did not feed in parameters like, for example, patients. Do they have ways to get to the hospital? Do they want to get to hospital, even if the data tells them that you have to visit this day? Do they want to do this? And those parameters are the ones that led to the failure of the model. Hence, they said the idea of something I don't know again. It's called inference statistics. So the idea is to correct this. They said, okay, maybe we should actually use inference statistics in which you associate data with with other things that are coming from somewhere else, which is basically the status of the patients. And then apparently that could help actually remedy this kind of failures of these models that are lacking the relevant information.
It's interesting because it makes me think about microeconomy. When we talk about microeconomy, is that how you can predict what people will buy according to their need, and so you calculate the value, the comparative value of the different kind of needs and what is actually available, and so that determine a price and how many will. And if I'm saying that, it's because it never works. It almost never works because when you try to make it on the long run or try to organize a certain kind of politics according to that, it almost never works because there is this element that you were talking about the model, why the model doesn't work, because at the end of the day, they didn't take into account the fact that there will be perturbation like bias, desire.
Exactly. But I warn you, so I don't think it didn't work. Maybe in that context it didn't work, but there are examples where it can work. I have in mind now Cambridge Analytica.
Oh yeah. With elections, even with election, with voting and all things like that. Yes, of course. It did. Cambridge Analytica. That's. Maybe we are a little bit finished, no? Or you?
But already like how it's going in Convergence, so we can finish.
I have a brief point. I just want to add a brief point to this, no worries. One of the reasons why the planned economy doesn't work, according to Friedrich Hayek, Michael Polanyi, and many great other Central European thinkers, is a problem of tacit knowledge, right? Which is, we've used this term desire a lot. You don't believe in the future. Maybe I don't believe in desire. I think perhaps it's the case that as I kind of alluded to earlier, that brain and mind are a complex negotiation of a game theoretic problem on a scale that is unrivaled by any economy. And this is all inside single individual people, right?
I see what you mean.
There are competitive processes behind all of your motivations and things that you could be doing now, doing later, et cetera, et cetera. And desire is one such output. You can think about that all of our preferences to us are tacit, they're unknown. We do have a prediction of what our preferences may be based off of our prior behavior, right, which we might call our class of preferences, but that not actually is the thing that is desire that's used by the organism. So, one thing I would think about with regards to Manal's question, right, is how is it the case that we deal with bias in the real world? Generally speaking, what you do is you have different experts and they debate the issue, so on and so forth, right? So perhaps something like multi-agent systems that then negotiate in the same way that the mind negotiates to come up with its preferences can kind of work together on a collective level to kind of provide one unitary output. Which
I like this idea of negotiations in the mind. Yeah, you might be right. So basically, you say that when I'm talking about desire, it's because I'm unable to know about all the details of the negotiation that are actually happening. Yeah, we could discuss that. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you please also answer this question, because I want to know your perspective about the bias and everything.
Oh, the question of bias. Yeah. I mean, the question of bias, I think it's the very question of the relation between the human world and the computer itself. And so the relation we have when we put the computer received information from the human world, and of course the bias that are in the human world are reproduced in the computer, and they can be reproduced in a stronger way if you are in a certain context and another context. In fact, I will say, as we said a lot, it's all about context. And maybe we could end this debate talking about context, because and saying that it's interesting when you were talking about this Nobel Prize that pronounced this sentence that can be outrageous. It's interesting to see that even a Nobel Prize, who knows so much, obviously forgot that language is all about context.
So just to finish
Okay.
there, because we are already over time, and I
all
was
right.
really excited about this discussion. Just one last message from each one of you about this convergence, and we see that we are collectively trying to have a brighter future with AI and every science. What are your recommendations for the future, and how can we combine these disciplines and technical skills, or in general all the skills, to achieve what we want to do in the
Oh my
future?
God. Good luck, my friends.
Well, I would say really be curious and embrace sort of as many disciplines as you can that are relevant to the subject. So I think science always happens at the intersection, I think, of fields. And I think cognitive neuroscience by now has become a field of its own. Now you have the field of neuro-AI, which is basically the intersection of cognitive neuroscience and AI, which again is like, I think is massively reaping, we're already reaping the benefits from that. So try to think beyond your own discipline. I think be curious about what other disciplines are doing and saying. And so in that sense, I think convergence and finding synergies between fields is the way to go. I would say it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, for the convergence between neuroscience and artificial intelligence, I would say, embrace it. Actually, it's a tool. It's a fantastic tool it's not that it will revolutionize. It is really impacting so much the way we look at almost every aspect of our life. But I would add, on the top of that, you have to be Kantian when you do this. All right? So you really have to have a Kantian vision, Kantian critical mindset when you really are doing this. That's my message.
So I kind of have two recommendations. One is we have to bring biology back into this. We're talking about living organisms, but oftentimes we talk about the brain as this abstracted thing, right? The mystery behind why do we have a brain at all is contained in the life cycle of an oyster, which starts its life in this kind of pupal stage. It has, a certain number of reflexes and actions it can take where it navigates to places. And then when the oyster finds a place where it's going to grow up as an adult, it attaches to the rock and it goes through a denervation process and it loses basically all of the neurons in its system, right? But that's something you have to know if you want to understand brains, is you have to understand something like the oyster and what its life cycle is. The second reason why it's important to study biology is because I think that AI has been captured very strongly by Platonic idealism. And this is kind of this idea behind the algorithm being different from the implementation of the system. So the more that you study, I think, the mathematics of biology and how it is that living systems and collections of living systems come to their decisions and make complex navigations in the real world, I think you'll have a little bit more, inspiration for thinking about how we should start wiring up our artificial systems to reflect ones in the real world. So overall, that would be my recommendation.
Thank you. You, Raphael?
Yeah, I think at the current time we are talking about the risk of AI to replace human and all that. There is all those, I think, fantasies. But in the same time, I think there is a risk. There is a real risk, but is usually not pointing out. At least I haven't heard about it. And for me, that's the main risk of AI. It's what I call the epistemic or epistemological risk, because science was made out of theories. What is a theory? Theoria in Greek, that means perspective, actually. That means to see. So to have at a distance, to understand a system of relations and to say, okay, that works this way. I have a theory about it. And it's what in theory of knowledge they call coherentism. It's not only pragmatism, it's not only factualism, it's coherentism. It's coherent. You have a coherent picture. Say, oh, I know why it works. But AI works with correlations, correlation of data. And at one moment, it's like we are losing track of the link between those data. What I mean is, because we're talking about medicine, and it's very obvious in medicine, you can have different data saying like the color of your eyes, the color of your hair, when were you born, and your skin, and your blood rhesus, and many information. But the interesting point is, the scary point is that at the end of the day, those data are heterogeneous data. So you don't know the relation between those data. But when you put in the black box of AI and you correlate it, those data with millions, sometimes billions of data of other people that live in Australia that have the same color of your eyes, the same age, etc. You can say there is 84.5% of chance for you to have a liver cancer stage 2 at this age. It's actually true, but we don't know why. What I mean is we don't have a picture, and because it's going very fast and it can compute even more data and more and more and more data, it's like if for the first time in the history of humanity, the more we become efficient, the less we know why in a very theoretical way. And I think it's what I call the epistemological risk that is not pointing out. I don't know why, strangely, but it's what I'm scared about. Because I will always choose, of course, to survive, to go in the direction of the statistical correlation, even if we don't know really why, because it's still heterogeneous data. I can see that you have something to say.
Yeah, no, I think because you say it's not pointed out, I think it's this is I think the difference between prediction and understanding. So you can use these systems to predict, but you don't necessarily understand them. So and I think explainable AI is kind of like an effort into that direction. And I totally agree. Science is in the end about understanding. We don't just want to predict.
And it's hard. What is happening now in this? Because it's like there is a convergence, but we converge where? And you need theory. You need when you converge, vision. Anyway,
Thank you so much. And I'm sure that we are always more part of many other disciplines. And I'm sure if we bring other like anthropologists or other economists, social scientists, they have other perspectives to how we can work collectively and like a piece of puzzles to bring the brighter future. And this is an invitation to all disciplines to work collectively and be transdisciplinary so we can achieve and reshape the future like we want it to be. Let me thank all of our panelists, Professor Flores de Lange, Professor Karim Fifel, Professor Cody Moser, and Professor Raphael Liogier for all your interaction and your insightful comments. Thank you and have a nice rest of the day. And thank you for the audience for being patient with us even though we passed the time. Thank you.
And come this afternoon at Amphi Asni, 2 p.m.
Oh, it was really nice.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed your talk. Yeah, it was very rich. Yeah.